us at any point. Without objection, the gentlewoman from New York, Mrs. Malliotakis, is permitted to sit in on the dais and ask questions of the witnesses. And as an FYI, it is her birthday today. Without objection, written testimony from Ms. Stephanie Crisp Canales, a Texas rancher who lives near the border and unfortunately couldn't be here today to testify in person, will be entered into the record. No objection, so ordered. The purpose of this hearing is to receive testimony on Secretary Mayorkas' open border policies and how they've taken a financial toll on all Americans, and I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Last week, the committee heard compelling testimony about the human costs of Joe Biden and Secretary Mayorkas' open border policies. As we've heard, and as this committee's investigation found, countless migrants have been victimized through forced labor, sex trafficking, and child exploitation. This comes from multiple sources and is even why the minorities witness last week said they sued multiple administrations. Border Patrol agents and their families have been completely overwhelmed by the crisis, with agents feeling that Mayorkas' policies have left them unable to do their jobs. And America's fentanyl crisis has reached a horrific level, devastating families all across this country, as tens of thousands of Americans are now dying from fentanyl poisoning every single year. Just to underscore the heavy human toll of this crisis, barely 2 days ago, after this hearing, a 1-year-old little boy, Nicholas Feliz Dominici, died at a daycare facility in the Bronx after being exposed to fentanyl during his nap time. 3 other precious children required emergency treatment. Police found about 1 kilo of fentanyl on multiple kilo presses, which are used by the dealers to package large quantities of drugs. Americans are not safe, even in a daycare facility. There's no room for doubt that Secretary Mayorkas is making our communities more dangerous. His policies are putting American lives and livelihoods at risk. Mayorkas has implemented a radical agenda at the expense of the safety, security, and economic well-being of all Americans. And this crisis isn't only imposing a human cost, it's imposing a financial cost too. As the people's representatives, with the constitutional power of the purse, we have a duty to conduct oversight and expose how taxpayer dollars are being abused in support of this radical open borders agenda. Over the past several months, the committee has investigated how the Biden-Mayorkas border crisis has cost the American taxpayer, and our findings have been shocking. First, let's talk about a subject that impacts every single one of us, health care. In 2022, Congress's Joint Economic Committee reported that the opioid epidemic cost our country almost $1.5 trillion in 2020. Imagine what those costs are now. In January of this year, another report found that treatment for opioid use disorder is costing hospitals almost $100 billion a year. That's about 8% of total hospital costs, and fentanyl is the primary reason. According to numbers published by HHS, Medicaid spending on emergency services for undocumented aliens in FY21 alone cost $7 billion compared to $1.6 billion in FY16. For comparison, that's more than the entire operating budget this year of Biden's home state of Delaware. And based on past numbers, Texas is likely now spending more than $1 billion on health care for illegal aliens. Illegal aliens recently cost Florida hospitals about $312 million, with providers having to absorb more than $200 million of those costs. Illinois' health care fund for illegal aliens has risen from the projected $2.2 to $4 million to over $1.1 billion. Meanwhile, illegal aliens are taking up limited health care resources that should be reserved for Americans and other lawful citizens. Residents. We're using emergency rooms and medical facilities that citizens could be using. Joel Martinez, Chief Patrol Agent of the Border Patrol's Laredo sector, recently told this committee. Another Chief Border Patrol agent told us that he has observed women crossing the border illegally simply to have babies in U.S. hospitals. The majority of illegal aliens are uninsured and use emergency rooms to receive care of all kinds, from the routine to the severe. And as a doctor and medical entrepreneur, I can tell you those costs are being passed on to taxpayers, increasing the cost of care for the rest of us. Cities and states have also borne massive increases in law enforcement costs due to the crisis. Texas alone has spent more than $4 billion to secure its border and is on pace to spend billions more just in the next 2 years to defend itself. Tarrant County, Texas, home to Fort Worth, averages 246 inmates with immigration detainers at any given time, costing the county more than $3.6 million per year. In Brooks County, Texas, Sheriff Benny Martinez has said that county officials took pay cuts in order to afford the cost of burying or cremating illegal aliens found deceased on the U.S. side of the border. Think about that. They took a pay cut just to bury the dead found at the border. McMullen County, Texas, home to around 600 residents, is now spending roughly $500,000 every year to deal with this crisis. Sheriff Mark Daniels of Arizona's Cochise County testified in February that in 2022, quote, border-related bookings cost a total of $4.3 million, with 1,578 suspects booked into the county jail for border-related crimes. An increasing number of states are now also sending law enforcement and National Guard troops to the southwest border to assist Texas and others, incurring hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars in additional costs. Ranchers. The ranchers along our southwest border are dealing with the unprecedented consequences of this crisis as well. As illegal aliens cross the border, they tear down their fences, damage homes, break water lines, and leave piles of trash on the ground. One Texas rancher who hosts game hunts on his land has said that repairing the fence damage by trespassing illegal aliens costs $26,000 per mile. Another rancher has said that hunting blinds on his property worth $3,000 to $5,000 and which are key to his business have been destroyed by illegal aliens. An Arizona rancher who owns a 50,000-acre ranch told this committee in June that repairs to his ranch cost more than $60,000 per year and that his property value is down by more than $1 million because of the ongoing crisis at the border. Another has recounted that in 2021, he lost 130,000 gallons of fresh water and endured more property damage than if he were to add 30 years together. Then there's the cost to clean up the trash, the litter left by trespassing illegal aliens on ranchers' land that is not only unsightly but poses an active hazard to grazing livestock. All these costs are an added insult to the loss of security these ranchers and their families feel at the nonstop flow of illegal aliens through their property, some of them with hostile intentions or being guided by cartel operatives. It also costs money to educate the hundreds of thousands of illegal alien children, particularly those with limited proficiency in English. In New York City, one teacher recently told the New York Post, "We're overwhelmed. We've all got migrant students in our classroom. The teachers don't speak a lick of Spanish. There's no resources helping us right now. It's a very challenging situation," end quote. The city could spend around $440 million just to educate illegal alien children that have arrived on Mayorkas' watch. Hotels. Because Secretary Mayorkas has refused to comply with the law requiring him to detain illegal aliens, cities and states have been forced to pick up the tab. According to the Wall Street Journal in August 23, quote, over 100,000 migrants have come to New York City since the spring of 2022 and continue to arrive at a rate of more than 2,000 a week, end quote. The city estimates it will spend around $12 billion on services and benefits for illegal aliens by 2025. According to city officials in June, it cost $385 per night to provide shelter to an illegal alien family unit at a cost of $8 million a day. Compare this to roughly $150 per night it would cost to hold these family units in ICE detention facilities. Mayor Eric Adams even recently predicted that this border crisis will, quote, destroy New York City, end quote, claiming with 10,000 illegal aliens coming every month, every service in the city will be impacted. Chicago is also spending more than $20 million per month to house and support illegal aliens. Washington, D.C. is expected to spend $52 million by October. The small town of Sanford, Maine, more than 2,000 miles from the southwest border, has said it allocated $155,000 this fiscal year to house and care for illegal aliens, but has now spent more than $483,000, with local authorities saying, we've been overrun. This is just a taste of the devastating financial cost of Mayorkas' border crisis. Costs being borne not just by the federal government, by state and local governments as well. And those dollars are ultimately being extracted from the wallets of hardworking, tax-paying men and women of this country, all to subsidize mass illegal immigration. While families are struggling to make ends meet in a period of high inflation and soaring gas prices, our government is spending billions of dollars on aid for illegal aliens. This is unacceptable, and we all know it is. According to one recent report, illegal immigration is costing U.S. taxpayers at least $180 billion this year. Other estimates put the cost of this self-inflicted crisis in excess of $500 billion. It's simply staggering, and it's infuriating. In my home state of Tennessee, illegal immigration cost taxpayers nearly $1 billion just last year. Again, this money is being taken out of the hands of hardworking Americans and given to those who've entered our country unlawfully and now demand the same benefits of American citizens. Apparently, this is just another unwelcome aspect of Bidenomics Americans are forced to deal with. Because Secretary Mayorkas has opened the border, every state must put billions of their own funds into increased policing, keeping fentanyl out of schools, and paying for welfare programs created to support American citizens. All these costs are adding up. Secretary Mayorkas is busy trying to convince the American people of things they know are false. He continues to claim that the border is secure when the American people can plainly see with their own eyes that it's wide open and that the Mexican drug cartels exercise unprecedented control over our southwest border. He's also tried to convince Congress of these same claims on multiple occasions, falsely representing the facts of the crisis to members of this committee and others, under oath. The only winners from Mayorkas' dereliction of duty are the cartels, who are watching the United States pay dearly to undermine its own borders. For the open borders advocates in this administration, no cost is too great as long as they get what they want. Americans are fed up with politicians who waste their tax dollars and think they know better than everyday Americans. Now, Democrats today are going to highlight the increased economic activity produced by people who are here in the country, and that somehow a new restaurant started by an illegal migrant is financially a net positive for the country. If that were the case, Mayor Adams in New York City, a Democrat, would not be screaming at the top of his lungs how this mass wave is destroying his city. And the governor of Massachusetts would not be demanding more money from the federal government. If it's a net positive from a financial standpoint, then send more money back to help us pay off the debt. But apparently it's not, and that's why they're asking for money. No one's going to be fooled by this ruse, but I look forward to the entertaining presentation. Instead of protecting our country and securing our border, Secretary Mayorkas is wasting taxpayer dollars and the cartels are profiting. Until Secretary Mayorkas starts doing his job, following the laws passed by this Congress, both parties of this Congress, Americans are going to continue to be on the hook for the wasteful, needless, and often deadly costs incurred by this self-inflicted crisis. We all know it, and this committee is going to hold them accountable. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin my opening statement today, I'd like to acknowledge that today marks 6 years since Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Our fellow citizens in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands are still recovering. While we remember and pay tribute to the thousands who perished in that tragedy, I hope this committee will use this time, as it did in the last 2 Congresses, to improve the Department of Homeland Security's emergency response and recovery capabilities. Tragedies like Hurricane Maria serve as a stark reminder that this committee has a duty to examine all parts of DHS. I'd also like to take this opportunity to acknowledge one of my longest-serving advisors, Rosalind Cohen, who will be leaving the committee soon. Rosalind has been with the committee since I became ranking member, the first time in 2005, and she's been Democratic Chief Counsel since 2007. As Chief Counsel, Rosalind has been essential to both legislative and oversight missions of this committee. Her dedicated service has resulted in more than 400 pieces of committee legislation passed by the House, and more than 150 of those measures becoming law. I'd have more to say about this next week, but for now, Rosalind, thank you for the 18 years of service to the Committee on Homeland Security, and best of luck to you and your family in the future. Now I'll turn my prepared remarks for this hearing. Well, Mr. Chairman, here we are again, not at a legitimate oversight hearing, but yet another political dog and pony show. This isn't serious border oversight. That much is obvious to anyone who actually understands oversight or the border. Republicans don't really want to address border challenges, and they surely don't want to fix our broken immigration system. They don't even want to fulfill their responsibility to fund the government, including our border security agencies. Republicans are threatening to cut funding for critical border security operations, which would create chaos at the border, empower the cartels, hurt our economy, and put the lives of the border agents and officers at risk. That's the exact opposite of what you do when you actually cared about strengthening border security. Instead of working with Democrats to avert a government shutdown, and instead of working with committed Democrats on meaningful legislation, Republicans are squabbling amongst themselves and holding sideshows. Instead of dealing with the problems of their own making, Republicans are projecting their own dysfunction on the Department of Homeland Security and pursuing a baseless impeachment effort against Secretary Mayorkas. They prefer to yell, try to twist Democrats' words to fit the false narrative, and play the blame game to score political points with their base. They want a wedge issue, not solutions. They want to distract from their own infighting and obvious inability to govern. They want to appease the extreme MAGA members of their party. They don't want the American people to realize their extreme MAGA members have the Republican Party in a chokehold and are squeezing the life out of it. There used to be Republicans who wanted to make progress on issues Americans care about. Last Congress, for example, Ranking Member John Katko and I worked together to get 47 committee measures enacted. By contrast, this Congress, Republicans have been on a crusade to impeach Secretary Mayorkas, though there's zero justification for it. That spectacle has now apparently been overshadowed by an equally baseless impeachment of President Biden. In fact, Monday, the chairman lamented to Punchbowl News that impeaching Secretary Mayorkas is not as, quote, juicy, unquote, as impeaching the president. Cabinet secretaries or a president shouldn't be impeached over policy differences. That's not what the Constitution says. That's not what the founders intended. And they certainly shouldn't be impeached because it's, quote, unquote, juicy enough to hold the attention of fringe right-wing Republican members. Republicans hope this sham exercise will be juicy red meat for their extreme MAGA base, but it looks like Swiss cheese to everyone else. Action speaks louder than words when it comes to addressing the border, and unfortunately, at every turn, Republicans have offered divisive rhetoric and political games rather than actual resources or meaningful action. They want to dupe Americans into thinking they're tough on border security by embracing the ex-president's old failed policies while doing almost nothing to address the dysfunction those policies help create. Fortunately, the American people aren't easily fooled by these theatrics. Last week, Republicans invited a witness, supposedly, to testify about sex trafficking. It turns out their star witness reportedly resigned from the organization he founded after an investigation uncovered alleged sexual misconduct with 7 women. That speaks volumes about the kind of hearings the majority is holding. They don't care about the character of the witness they invited or his organization's false claims or dubious fundraising activities. They just wanted someone to attack Secretary Mayorkas. Also last week, some Republicans all but mocked Democrats for caring about thousands of kids intentionally taken from their parents by the Trump administration. They even downplayed the facts that hundreds of children remain separated from their parents years after they were taken away by the Trump administration. Apparently, they want people to think it's old news, but it's not. Donald Trump is currently the front runner for the Republican presidential nomination. He's their standard bearer. He said he'd bring back the policies and others like it if he's reelected. Democrats are unwavering in our opposition to immoral policies like family separation. Mr. Chairman, no Republican grandstanding will ever, quote, move the needle, unquote, on that. Democrats are steadfast in support of efforts to achieve an orderly and humane border. We refuse to believe that the only way to address border and immigration challenges is to embrace the cruel and ineffective policies of the Trump administration. Today, we're going to hear a lot about the cost of migration and its effect on communities. There are near-term costs, to be sure. So we must do what we can to support places like New York, Chicago, and the District of Columbia, and cities along the southwest border receiving asylum seekers. I'm heartened that the Biden administration is increasing resources for communities and NGOs assisting migrants and requesting additional funding for the Shelter and Services Program. That's a very good start, but more remains to be done. We have to make it possible for asylum seekers to support themselves by working and paying taxes while their cases are adjudicated. The Biden administration is working to inform those eligible to apply for work authorization about the necessary steps to access the process. Migrants overwhelmingly want to contribute to our society, and they do contribute. Data shows that immigrants from all types contribute significantly to the U.S. economy, fuel our growth, and provide a net benefit to our country's finances by paying billions in taxes annually. There's no reason to think these asylum seekers will be any different than those who came before them. I'd like to think this committee would have productive discussions about the way forward on the border. But if the last half dozen Republican hearings are any indication, I won't count on it. MAGA extremists probably wouldn't find it juicy enough. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record, and I'm pleased to have an important panel of witnesses before us today. I ask that our witnesses please rise and raise their right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you. You may be seated. I'd now like to formally introduce our witnesses. Mr. Jonathan Lyons is the District 2 Supervisor for the Yuma County Board of Supervisors in Yuma County, Arizona. The board oversees much of the county's daily governance. Prior to leading the state Republican Party for 3 years, he chaired his county party for 3 terms and served as the Arizona Republican Party treasurer. Mr. Lyons also serves as the Arizona-Mexico Commission on the Arizona-Mexico Commission and is the chairman of the Arizona State Fair and Expositions. Joseph Borelli is the minority leader of the New York City Council representing the 51st District of Staten Island, as well as a member of the council's budget negotiation team. He was formerly the chair of the Committee on Fire and Emergency Management, which has legislative oversight over the agency now managing New York's migrant crisis. Formerly, he was a member of the New York State Legislature and its ranking member of the Committee on Cities. Mr. Borelli is the current chair of the National Forum of Republican Mayors and Council Members and adjunct lecturer of political science at the City University of New York and a former Lindsay Fellow at City of New York's Institute of State and Local Governance. Mr. Aaron Melnick, okay, thanks, is policy director at the American Immigration Council, where he directs the council's administrative and legislative advocacy efforts to provide lawmakers, policymakers, advocates, and the public with accurate and timely information about the role of immigrants in the United States. He previously served as the senior policy counsel, where he worked primarily on border and immigration court issues and the intersection of immigration law and policy. I thank all the witnesses for being here today, and I now recognize Mr. Lyons for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, members of the committee. My name is Jonathan Lyons, and I am a lifelong resident of Yuma, Arizona, where I currently serve on the County Board of Supervisors. My community is situated as close as 2 miles to the Mexican border. And it has allowed me firsthand to witness the devastating effects of this administration's reckless open border policies. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share with each of you this morning the impact of these policies have had on the community that I've called my home my entire life. As a county supervisor in Yuma, I have a broad understanding of the financial and human costs that are associated with our open border to Mexico. First and foremost, our financial impact on Yuma's $4 billion agriculture industry. Indeed, agriculture is the #1 industry in Yuma, and our farms produce many of the fruits and vegetables that are distributed throughout North America. In fact, 91% of the leafy greens, romaine, lettuce, and spinach consumed in the United States and Canada from Thanksgiving through Easter are grown, processed, and shipped from farms in the Yuma growing region. This industry ultimately brings in more than $4 billion to the community each year. The surge in illegal immigration has had a devastating effect on this critical industry in Arizona. People crossing illegally travel on foot, urinate and defecate in fields and irrigation canals on the farms after they cross the border, which ruins whatever crop is growing in that particular farm. Farmers must abide by a stringent food safety rules, and this trespass and the defecating in production areas renders these crops grown completely unmarketable. Thus, the crop is destroyed, and farmers must bear this staggering loss. As a result, farmers in Yuma have had to invest millions since this administration took office in crop loss to hire security and build fences around their farms to protect our nation's food supply. We find it bitterly ironic that private citizens must build fences literally yards away from the U.S. border fence when the materials to finish were paid for, delivered, but a cease and desist order was given immediately after the inauguration, and we saw the materials every day stacked at the ready, but untouched for a purpose, unfinished fence with huge gaps and people pouring across, threatening our livelihoods. And now this administration instead are selling off at a loss the materials at the border, which were purchased and designated to be used to construct a finished border wall. We must prevent more devastating loss of time and staggering expense in a recall of produce or plowing under acres of crops among discovery of human fecal matter or footprints or migrant trash. If we don't stop the flood of illegal immigration coming across our border and trampling over the crops in Yuma, this situation at all costs will worsen for farming families that fuel this critical industry. Briefly, talking about human trafficking increase in Yuma, I serve as the chairman of Amberley's Place, where we've seen a sharp number in people identifying as being self-trafficked. We do have a memorandum of understanding with Mexico where we can, if it has been determined that a jurisdiction or an occurrence has taken place in Mexico, we can process that and remit that evidence back to Mexico. Each year, anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 children are trafficked through Yuma County. And as you can see, the negative impacts of our open border are more than just financial. Real trauma and abuse is occurring every day in my community. And it's a travesty that each time we find ourselves unable to provide justice for these victims who have been trafficked by members of transnational cartels and their allies, where our community must bear the brunt of costs of medical treatment, counseling, and therapy for thousands of victims seeking help in Yuma. Our food banks have been impacted, crime, and our first responders have been impacted. Most importantly, our first responders end up transporting these illegal immigrants to the local hospital, which brings about another huge financial cost that is often overlooked. Dr. Trenchell has been before this committee before and testified in the more than 26 million worth of migrants within an 18-month period. Last but not least, impact on military readiness. We have 2 military bases in Yuma, and in recent conversations with MCS Yuma's Chief of Security, I learned that uncontrolled and unregulated migration of illegal immigrants has interfered with critical military training without even knowing it. Many of these illegal migrants are putting their lives in grave danger as they end up crossing through our military ranges while on their way to the city of Yuma. In the coming weeks ahead, we're going to hear a lot about the sheer number of migrants who have crossed into the United States illegally as the fiscal year is about to come to an end. While these numbers are sure to be staggering, I hope the information I presented today gives each one of you additional context to better understand the severity of the border crisis.
Thank you, Mr. Lyons. I now recognize Mr. Borelli for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Green and Ranking Member Thompson. Let me start with a blunt quote. The migrant crisis will destroy New York City. Those aren't my words. They aren't the words of extreme MAGA members or right-wing hyperbole. Those are the words spoken by Democratic New York City Mayor Eric Adams at a town hall in Manhattan 2 weeks ago. Though Mayor Adams and I disagree on many things, including how the city has managed the massive influx of migrants to our city, I'll give him credit for being the virtually only elected official in his own party to say out loud, repeatedly and in public, that the open border policies of this White House, Secretary Mayorkas, and the federal agencies under their control have been an absolute disaster for New York. And the people of my city are paying for it. The numbers are staggering. More than 125,000 migrants have flooded into New York City over the past 18 months. On average, about 60,000 individual migrants remain in our city's care each night, according to the latest statistics. Based on the current rate of about 9,000 migrants each month, the city expects to shelter over 78,000 individuals in the current fiscal year at a cost of $4.7 billion. By next fiscal year, assuming no action is taken by the federal government and New York doesn't amend its own policies, the city anticipates the average daily number of migrants in shelters could be more than 100,000 at a cost of $6.1 billion in that fiscal year. Adding the approximately $1.5 billion we have already spent, the total projected cost of sheltering migrants in New York City will exceed $12 billion over 3 fiscal years. To put that in perspective, over the next year alone, we will spend enough money to cover the entire budget of Dallas, Texas, meaning for the cost of sheltering migrants, New York City taxpayers could pay to man every firehouse, police station, pick up the garbage, maintain the water and sewers, inspect the buildings, run the airport, and even cut the grass in Dallas parks, a city of 1.3 million people. Over the next 2 years, we can do the same for both Philadelphia and Phoenix as well. These enormous costs are being borne almost entirely by the taxpayers of New York City. The Biden administration recently touted that they have provided $140 million in aid to reimburse the city for this crisis. This represents, at best, 1% of the projected cost. Incredibly, despite the crisis being caused by federal inaction at the border, the U.S. Department of the Interior is charging the city $21 million, plus tens of millions more in management fees and capital improvements, to lease Floyd Bennett Field, a historic National Park Service site. New Yorkers are essentially now paying for the loss of their public federal parkland. Returning to the $140 million already earmarked, the city spent double that on migrants in July alone. So at the current burn rate of about $10 million per day, federal aid would pay for about 2 weeks of sheltering migrants in New York City. Since the Department of Interior is now allowing national parks to be alienated to house migrants, perhaps it's time for the federal government to open shelter sites in national parks in other states and cities with lower costs, and where local elected officials have similarly declared sanctuary jurisdictions. These unanticipated and unsustainable expenses are the reason our mayor is preparing to possibly cut the city budget by a total of 15% by next spring. That could amount to roughly $16 billion in savings. To give another comparison, that is more than all the revenue generated by the government of Venezuela, a country from which many of these migrants have fled. These cuts could have devastating and far-reaching real-world consequences, affecting every essential service the city must provide, from keeping communities safe and our streets clean to educating children and maintaining critical infrastructure, perhaps even requiring layoffs. This would ultimately wreak havoc on New York's economy, which has yet to recover from the pandemic recession. Right now, almost every community in our city is on edge, fearing the next migrant shelter will be in their backyard, worrying about how this growing crisis will affect every aspect of life in New York. They are right to be alarmed, and unless we reverse the disastrous policy decisions that have brought us to this point on both the local and federal level, there will be no end in sight, and this migrant crisis eventually will destroy New York. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Borelli. I now recognize Mr. Reckland-Melnick for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, and distinguished members of the committee. My name is Aaron Reckland-Melnick, and I am Policy Director at the American Immigration Council. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to the belief that immigrants are part of our national fabric and to ensuring that the United States provides a fair process for all immigrants, including those seeking protection. The Council has long studied the economic impacts of immigration to the United States, including for groups who, like migrants crossing the border today, do not arrive through programs that pre-select immigrants based on their economic benefit. Our data reveals that refugees, temporary protected status holders, and undocumented immigrants collectively contribute over $56 billion in federal, state, and local taxes every year, help fuel economies through high entrepreneurship rates, and make outsized contributions in many of the key fields powering American economic growth. I'm grateful for the opportunity to provide our analysis on the financial impact of migration and to offer ways to unlock the talents of newly arrived migrants and reduce fiscal impacts on local budgets. My testimony aims to emphasize two key perspectives. First, economic research carried out at the Council and by academics around the world have shown that immigrants of all types, including humanitarian immigrants like asylum seekers, contribute substantially to the United States economy and generally provide a net benefit to our finances. Even refugees, who receive extensive federal support on arrival, will over their lifetime pay more into the system than they take out of it. It's long been said that immigration is this country's secret sauce. Many of our ancestors came here with nothing more than a few dollars and a dream and made this country their home, contributing their talents and making us the richest and most powerful nation in history. Unfortunately, the last time Congress updated our legal immigration system was November 1990, 1 month before the World Wide Web went online and when the Soviet Union was still around. The immigration process today is plagued by exorbitant fees, unnecessary barriers, and decades-long delays. But as the system becomes increasingly inaccessible, the need for robust immigration has only increased. As baby boomers age out of the workforce, we risk going the way of Japan or China, facing a steep demographic cliff which threatens to erase decades of economic gains and weaken our status internationally. That's why our research shows that we need immigrants of all skill levels to keep America thriving and great. Second, when examining the economic impact of migration, we must recognize the ways in which our outdated humanitarian protection systems act as a barrier to migrant self-sufficiency, leading to unnecessary and counterproductive strains on local budgets. The most prominent example of this is Congress's decision in 1996 to bar asylum applicants from receiving work authorization until 180 days after filing the application. At the time, most asylum cases were decided within 6 months. Today, the average asylum case takes 4 to 6 years or longer. Even if Congress was right 27 years ago that a restriction on work permits would have a marginal deterrent effect on asylum seekers, today this restriction causes nothing but harm. It has forced state and local governments to provide emergency assistance for people who want to support themselves but are banned from doing so. It bears repeating. Migrants wouldn't need long-term shelter if they could pay for an apartment themselves, and Congress has the authority to make that possible. Over the last decade, the need for us to get humanitarian protection right has become increasingly important as growing numbers of people around the world resort to irregular pathways to seek safety and a better life. Today, displacement and migration are at record levels globally, not just in the Western Hemisphere and certainly not just to the United States. Unfortunately, rather than respond to the situation with innovative ideas and a rekindled commitment to humanitarian leadership, the United States keeps doubling down on ineffective deterrence policies and costly measures like border walls, which fail to stem migration or lead to improvements in resilient processing systems. Over the last 20 years, we've spent $200 billion on ICE and the Border Patrol and less than $9 billion on immigration courts to adjudicate those cases. So is it any surprise that we're seeing record backlogs? The federal government undoubtedly can do more to shield local budgets from the incidental costs of responding to this migration. If we change our approach by funding adjudication, building dedicated processing centers, revamping outdated laws, and ensuring a national response for a national issue, we can build a modern humanitarian protection system that is fair, flexible, robust, and that unlocks the talents that immigrants have long brought to this country. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. And members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning. An additional round of questioning may be called after all members have been recognized. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Mr. Lyons, one recent cost study estimates that Arizona spends about $5,230 per alien to state taxpayers. This amounts to a whopping, I think, $2.37 billion. What are the overall costs, and particularly, do you mind highlighting a cost that would not be obvious to us, something that might be a taxpayer cost that's not just right at the, obviously, social services, we know we pay for those, but something that people don't expect.
Yuma has a disproportionately high unemployment rate, over 25%. I've been serving as the chairman of the food bank for the last 2 years. We cannot directly supply USDA product to those people coming across, but we support 17 NGOs. And that's one particular cost where we have not received any assistance other than from Governor Ducey and from the LDS Church through Salt Lake, where they've sent me, as chairman, 500,000 pounds of food, which I was able to distribute to the NGOs. That is one cost that we have borne, and we are appreciative of the assistance that we have received. Our Amberley's Place, where I currently serve as the chairman, is a women and children's emergency services shelter, where it is completely funded by the VOCA grants, which have diminished over the last few years, and then by our community, and we appreciate Governor Hobbs for backfilling that. Other than that, those costs are borne by our community. It's a multidisciplinary shelter where anybody can come and seek assistance. Aside from that, we have a shelter, Crossroads Shelter, and they have received only through the community support assistance.
Yeah, it's the unforeseen stuff like cost shifting in healthcare, and as I understand it, your hospital, people are having to drive 200 miles to have their babies because the hospital maternity wards are all full. Those are costs that just nobody knows about, nobody's adding in. Mr. Melnick, quick question for you. I think it was Mayor Adams who has gotten, really been the most vocal, sort of on the other side of the aisle about all of this, and the president's response has been, well, let's just try to keep all the migrants in Texas. And I don't know if you've seen some of the press where he talked about that, but I thought, and in your presentation and in the ranking member's presentation, there was this net positive. Why would the president want to keep them in Texas if there's a net positive?
Well, I believe, importantly, the program that's been talked about keeping migrants in Texas would be keeping them there for, I believe, about 2 to 3 weeks while they go through the credible fear process, and then if they pass...
Why not? Well, let me ask you this question. I mean, and maybe this is for Mr. Borelli. It's $400, $500 a night for a hotel room in New York City?
Yeah, the quote is about...
I stayed in Dallas the other day. It was like $200 for just a regular room in Dallas. It's $150 at a nice detention bed. Why don't we put people in a nice detention bed? I mean, maybe, Mr. Borelli, you can kind of talk about the difference between the empty ICE detention beds and the hundreds of dollars for these hotels where we're putting people.
Sure. I mean, one hotel in New York, the Roosevelt Hotel, the cost that the city's leasing it for is $200 per night, which is actually a discounted rate, it seems. There's 1,000 rooms, so that's $20 million per month, roughly, to pay for that one site, and there's 206 sites being used with similar costs. So, yeah, I mean, it would be wonderful. I think this is one of those areas where Mayor Adams and I would agree that it would be wonderful if some other sanctuary cities around the country would pick up the tabs, especially where there are cheaper hotels available.
This is for you, Mr. Lyons. How is the border crisis impacting? Well, I guess you just really talked about some of the charity services, so I'll go to my next question. Mr. Borelli, can you talk a little bit about education services to illegal aliens and what that's costing the city?
Sure. The cost per student in New York is about $38,000 per student. So we've seen about 20,000 children related to the migrant crisis enter our schools. Now, we have available space in many school buildings around the city. However, where we see the concentrations of hotels is also where we see the concentration of migrant shelters. So when you look at a very small neighborhood, you might have vast overcrowding in certain schools while the school down the block might be available. The impossibility is that folks are coming in 5, 6, 7,000 a month, and even on our best day, the good people of the Department of Education can't figure out how to sort and place these students. Now, the DOE just added $110 million to hire more language-specific teachers and teachers qualified for ESL, but that's $110 million that we were not expecting to spend.
Thank you. My time is up. I now yield to the ranking member for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much. Mr. Reichman, Melnick, unless my Republican colleagues start working with Democrats to pass a continuing resolution, the government will shut down in 10 days. This week, they are trying to bring to the House floor a proposal that cuts critical funding for the Department of Homeland Security, including its border security functions, by over 8%, while mandating that the department build a wall to detain migrants indefinitely. They still aren't putting forward serious policy proposals while other frontline officers worry about getting their next paycheck. Can you please speak to how a government shutdown would hurt the department's ability to secure the border and carry out its other responsibilities?
Yeah, I think there are two main impacts from a government shutdown on immigration and migration processing. We saw this in 2018, 2019. First, support staff. A lot of frontline agents, of course, are designated as essential personnel, so they would have to keep working without pay, and so that function would continue. But last time we had a shutdown, there were no Border Patrol processing coordinators, who are civilian, non-law enforcement assistants who help Border Patrol agents with migrant processing. And it's very unclear whether they would be designated essential. And the other big consequence of a shutdown is the immigration court systems where these cases are being adjudicated. Last time around, 90,000 cases had to be suspended for the entirety of the shutdown because the only courts that continue are the detained courts. And that would be even higher today because there's even more judges now than there were 4 years ago.
Thank you. So I represent an agricultural district in Mississippi. A lot of the crops we raise depend on immigrant labor. And that labor comes and produces significant positives for farmers and ranchers in the community. And I shudder to say that if the labor were not available, we'd have serious trouble in terms of getting the crops out of the field. Your organization has done excellent work on the topic showing the immigrant contribution to the U.S. economy. Can you expound a little bit on what that impact is on the U.S. economy?
Certainly. I think really quickly focusing on agriculture and meatpacking and other industries that feed the United States. We know that about 70% of farm workers in this country are undocumented. These are literally the people who are picking our crops and making sure we have food. But even when we look at other industries like meatpacking, more than 40% of all people who work in the meatpacking industry are immigrants, which is compared to the fact that there's less than 14% of the population is immigrants. So nearly twice as many people work in the field than are immigrants in the country. And the labor shortages in those industries are very significant. In the next 10 years, about 30% of all people who work in that industry are going to be over the age of 65. So we hear every single day that to keep these industries running, we need immigrants to come fill those jobs because there are simply not enough workers to do this. Job openings are up, wage growth has gone up in these industries over the last few years, and yet they are still telling us we need more people. You talk to local communities around the country, and that's what you hear.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Guest for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today for this hearing. Before I begin, I'd like to play a brief clip, please.
Never in my life have I had a problem that I did not see an ending to. I don't see an ending to this. I don't see an ending to this. This issue will destroy New York City. Destroy New York City.
Ms. Borelli, in your written testimony, you referenced this particular speech given by the mayor, and you actually set forth some financial figures detailing to the committee and to the American public just the extent of the financial distress that is being caused upon the great city of New York. You say that at the current rate, this year the city will spend $4.7 billion. That next year, you expect the city to spend over $6 billion to care for the immigrants that have come to New York. You put that into comparison with other major cities. Just for perspective, I would like to relate that to the budget of my and the ranking member's great state, the great state of Mississippi. Our budget for fiscal year 2022 was $5.8 billion. And our budget for fiscal year 2023 is $6.3 billion. So the information you have provided to us says that New York will spend next year almost as much money as the entire state of Mississippi spends to fund our entire state government. You talk about that there are anticipated expense cuts that are coming. You say that there are unanticipated and unsustainable expenses, that the reason the mayor's preparing to cut the city's budget by a total of 15%. You go on to talk about effective services, public safety, education, critical infrastructure, and possible layoffs. So I want to ask you, Ms. Borelli, first and foremost, do you agree with the statement of Mayor Adams that we just played here just moments ago?
I do. I think it has the potential to really diminish New York City's long-term financial future. I think it's a major problem. I wouldn't bet against us. You know, New York has come back before. I just don't know whether it'll be in my generation or perhaps the next generation. But yes, it would be correct to compare it to the budget of Mississippi, and I'm actually looking forward to visiting your state for the first time next month, so I'll see what that $6 billion buys your taxpayers. For us, it pays for these potential, at that point in the next fiscal year, about 78,000 migrants. And again, the mayor's cost estimate per day, per person, is about $383, so obviously that will continue to increase as long as buses are being sent from the border.
And Ms. Borelli, who do you blame for the current financial crisis that's being caused by the illegal immigration there in New York?
I blame the federal government. I mean, we have had, and I'll accept responsibility for not being able to push back against sanctuary city policies and the right to shelter policy in my city, but at the same time, we've had those in place since the 1980s. It's only been since this administration has took over, it's only been since Secretary Mayorkas has taken over, where we have had this level of unprecedented migration to our cities from people who are relying on the city taxpayer to provide every resource available to them.
And Ms. Borelli, you state there in your testimony, you say the open border policies of this White House, Secretary Mayorkas, and the federal agencies under their control have been an absolute disaster for New York. And so in the last few seconds of my time, I would like to give you the opportunity to address the President, Secretary Mayorkas, members of their staff who are likely watching this, and give you the opportunity to deliver a message. The message I would have to them would be secure the damn border. But I want you to have the opportunity in the last closing seconds to deliver a message to the Secretary in the White House.
Well, I'm a guest, so I wouldn't use four-letter words. So I would tell the President to close the border. And as a New Yorker, I'd tell the President to give us a bit more money to help with the crisis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Carter for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Witnesses, thank you all for being here. We're here to discuss the financial cost of the border. However, human cost is associated with previous extreme MAGA policies. Based on your collective knowledge and experience, can you share how the Trump administration's zero tolerance policy caused irreparable harm to young children and vulnerable families? In other words, what was the human cost to that horrific policy? All members, please, starting with you, sir.
I can't speak to what I saw under the Trump administration other than we had numbers that nowhere near rivaled what we were seeing today. And
Why, excuse me, why can't you speak to the Trump years?
well, when we were looking at the numbers from several years ago, they're significantly less as far as undocumented people coming through the border.
So do you think that the policies that we have and the issue with the border began last year?
No, they've been bad for a while, over the last 3 years, but we've never seen.
Just 3 years?
We've never seen what we're seeing now.
Excuse me, only 3 years?
We've never seen what we're seeing now.
Do you think the problems that we have at the border were only bad in the last 3 years? What about 5 years ago? What about 4 years ago?
They've tripled number-wise as far as what we see coming across the border.
Were they bad 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago?
They were 10 to 20 times less than what we see now.
I'm gonna try this one more time. Were they bad 5 years ago?
Yes, they were
Thank you.
bad.
Next, Mr. Borelli.
Thank you. No, I've never seen a situation where New York City or any other municipality that I have direct knowledge of has paid this amount of money for services provided to people who have crossed the border. That's not happened. And during the Trump
Can I interrupt you for a second, sir? Very respectfully, I'm going to ask the question again. Based on your collective knowledge and experience, can you share how the Trump administration's zero policy caused irreparable harm to young children and vulnerable families? Not New York City, we're just talking in general.
Sure. Well, my godson's mother immigrated to this country during the Trump administration. There were plenty of my neighbors who were admitted to this country during the Trump administration. Plenty of people got citizenship. There were tens of thousands of people who received asylum status during that administration. Again, though, what I have not seen in the difference between this administration and, frankly, the Trump administration and, frankly, the Obama administration was the sheer lack of resources and mass migration placed on America's cities.
So, and I'm going to go back to, as I queried the other member, do you think the problems are 3 years old, 5 years old, 10 years old? Because it appears from the testimony that this has somehow become an administration versus administration instead of an earnest attempt to find a solution. You know, the blame game, it won't solve the issues for the American people. What will solve the issues for the American people are honest discussions on how we can get better. And the assumption that somehow these problems began with the Biden administration is disingenuous at best.
I think it's fair and accurate to say that since the administration changed its policy on Remain in Mexico, since the changes in tactics and duties of border and custom agents, we just have a different scenario than we had in previous administrations. Again, I'm a New Yorker. There have been people who came to our city who are undocumented for as long as I can remember. But we have never had a crisis where 206 shelters are being placed willy-nilly in neighborhoods far and wide. We've simply never had that. We used to fight over homeless shelters like every city I'm sure you represent, where they go. They're controversial. People tend not to like living next to them. Now, seemingly overnight, in 1 year's time, we've placed 206 shelters.
I've got about 55 seconds. Real quickly, do you believe, yes or no, do you believe that individuals, families, and children deserve humane treatment?
100%.
Thank you. Mr. Melnick.
You know, the first time I saw a family seeking asylum was 2014 when I was just starting to become a lawyer. So, I mean, really, this is something that has been growing for a decade. We have seen this coming for quite some time under 3 different presidential administrations, and so far, we haven't made the major changes we need. On zero tolerance, I was at the border in 2018. I was in ICE detention centers interviewing parents who'd been separated from their children. I had a father sob, break down in tears, and beg to me, plead to me to help me get his kid back. And I'm never going to forget that, and I'm sure any child or parent who went through that, it's an experience that will never, ever go away.
And do you think this is something, as I've asked the other individuals, is this something that happened in the last 3 years?
This has been growing for a decade, and we need to have a national response for it.
And so we need a national response that's bipartisan and not one that is politically motivated to just pick at one party or the other, but come up with real solutions that address an age-old issue with problems at our border. Is that correct?
That's what I believe, yes.
I yield back. My time has expired.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Jimenez for his 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Borelli, how How many migrants are there now in New York City, newly arrived migrants, due to the border crisis?
In our care, about 62,000 that have come since the crisis began, about 125,000.
And when you, the number that you gave, that it's gonna cost New York City, what's that based on? What number is that based on?
That's based on the accumulation of various services that are offered, everything from housing. The cost.
Not the services, the number of people. How many people are you talking about?
Oh, that is what the Mayor Adams administration is estimating based on the number of people that are disembarking at bus terminals, Port Authority bus terminal, or that present themselves at migrant intake shelters.
Okay, so, but there's a number attached to that. And what's that number?
125,000 overall,
125,000, and how much is the cost?
383 per person per day.
Which is how much per year?
To be clear, some of those people have transitioned out of shelters, but the cost per year next year will be about 6.1 to 6.5 billion.
$6.1 billion
Correct.
for 125,000 people? A steady number of 125,000 people?
Correct.
All right, so that would be, all right, it's a pretty significant amount, and when you multiply that, let's say that amount by 5 million people, that, and I'm being generous, is to cross the border, we're looking at somewhere in the vicinity of well over about $170 billion. If you multiply that out throughout the United States, that's the cost right now of this crisis. That's a pretty significant amount that's coming out of U.S. taxpayer money. So, Mr. Melnick, you said that you had the experience of this, the father that was separated from his children, and that is a tragedy. I think they had like 5,000 families that were separated, during the Trump years, mainly because they're legally you can't incarcerate or hold minors in the same place you're holding adults. But what do you think is worse, that or the fact that this administration hasn't the faintest idea where 85,000 children are?
Congressman, I don't think there's anything that can be worse than taking a child from the arms of their parent, quite honestly.
Okay, and so the fact that their parent doesn't even know where their child is right now. I mean, there's 85,000 of them that nobody knows where they are.
That's actually not necessarily true. I think it is important to note that the 85,000 are simply people that the Office of Refugee Resettlement has not had contact with. They actually may be living with their parents. We know that in a lot of circumstances they are. So I think there's some confusion around that number. I don't think it's fair to say that it's 85,000 people who are missing from their parents.
But you can't say that. No, there's 85,000 people, 85,000 children that the U.S. government hasn't the faintest idea where they are. Is that an accurate statement?
The Office of Refugee Resettlement, unclear again. These may be people that may be going to school. We just don't know. And I agree it's something that should be investigated and we should have better controls on it. But I don't think it's fair to say that these are missing children.
Oh no, they're missing. They're missing. They're absolutely missing because we don't know where they are. And you can't tell me for sure that they're not in the arms of some sex trafficker, can you?
I think that is
Or an
highly
exploiter.
likely.
You can't say that for sure, can you?
No, the Office of Refugee Resettlement has not had contact with those parents or their sponsors, but again, that does not mean that they are missing. They may be actively involved in their local communities. Local governments may know where they are, but the Office of Refugee Resettlement hasn't been able to have contact with their sponsors.
That's great spin, man. I mean, I appreciate your spin, okay? But the fact is that they can't be found,
facts.
all right? No, they can't be found. And we know that the cartels are heavily involved in human trafficking and heavily involved in trafficking children. And if you saw the movie, I guess The Sound of Freedom, you would see what's really going on with the Mexican cartels and what they're doing to children. Because there's a market here, unfortunately, for that kind of thing. And so, I've got 25 seconds left. This crisis has been caused by the Biden administration, no doubt. And the problem with the Biden administration is that, hey, maybe they wanted to try a new policy that would solve the problem, but obviously what they've tried has failed. And this administration continues to pursue the same policy, the same failed policies that has seen our border be overrun and totally out of control during this time where we have well over 5 million migrants have rushed through. And by the way, in terms of their time to get a court date, anybody know how long, what's the average time to get a court date now for a migrant coming through?
We have seen people with 20, 33 court dates, meaning the lawyers are probably at Little League tonight. That'll be their attorney in that case in 10 years.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Magaziner for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman. You know, we could be and should be working together in a bipartisan way to address the humanitarian crisis at the border. Unfortunately, too many of my colleagues on the other side are more interested in pursuing political impeachments that they have been trying to ram through since day one, instead of working together in a bipartisan way where there's alignment on things that can help. And there are a lot of things that we know can help. More staffing and technology at the border, as President Biden has requested in his supplemental funding request, more streamlined processing of asylum claims, working with other countries in the region to address the root causes of migration, resources to control and crack down on the trafficking of firearms to the cartels, something that, unfortunately, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle never seem to want to talk about, but that is one of the key sources of the cartel's strength, is the illegal guns that it is too easy for them to get their hands on. But in the meantime, it is only right that the federal government assist local communities that are bearing costs related to migration. And I want to make sure that I heard you correctly, Mr. Lyons and Councilman Beretti. Is it fair for municipalities to bear the full cost of food and shelter and other emergency expenses related to migration? Is it fair that those costs be borne by the municipalities exclusively?
No. No, I mean, I think it's caused by the federal government.
So it's not fair for municipalities to bear the cost. And yet, my colleagues across the aisle, House Republicans, released a 2024 Homeland Security Appropriations Bill that completely eliminates the FEMA Shelter and Services Program, eliminates it, so that all of this expense that municipalities are incurring, the federal support for that would go away. I've got bad news for you guys. I mean, our Republican colleagues are trying actively to pass a budget that would force you to pick up the entire tab. And so you're gonna have to figure out, are you gonna raise taxes? Are you gonna cut services? Because they are trying to pull out the rug from under you. And it gets worse, by the way. They're trying to pass an education bill, an appropriations bill, that would eliminate 100,000 teaching positions under Title I, similar number of Head Start spots. Again, leaving the burden entirely on municipalities and school districts for these costs. So I appreciate the recognition that it's not fair that the federal government pull out the rug from municipalities, not just for emergency shelter and assistance, but also from education and other key services that cities and towns across the country work hard to deliver. But unfortunately, that's the agenda that's being pushed. And it gets worse than that, by the way. H.R. 2, which our colleagues across the aisle are trying to potentially shut down the government in order to jam through, denies federal funding to nonprofits and faith-based organizations that provide shelter, transportation, and other services to migrants. Mr. Lyons, I read in your biography that you're on the board of directors of an organization that assists victims of domestic violence and human trafficking. I don't know if your organization takes any federal grants or not, but if H.R. 2 gets through in its current form, don't even bother applying. Because, you know, despite the fact that we called attention to this in markup and that we fought against this, Mr. Garcia put in an amendment to take that portion of the language out of the bill. They left in this language that said that if you are providing any housing, transportation, if you're a nonprofit organization, a faith-based organization, you do not get any federal funding under DHS. So, listen, I would like to work together in a bipartisan way to address the root causes of migration, to address the humanitarian crisis at the border, which is real, but we don't do that by pulling back, and we certainly don't do it by leaving cities and towns and school districts and nonprofit organizations hung out to dry on their own. And by the way, I would love to hear, if we're talking about the costs associated with migration and not wanting to waste taxpayer dollars, I would love to hear someone, anyone on the other side, condemn the governor of Florida for spending taxpayer money, millions of taxpayer dollars, to send people to Texas, not even his own state, to fool people into getting on planes and sending them to Massachusetts and California and other places as a political stunt, never alerting the authorities in those locations that he was sending people there, but spending taxpayer money on this political stunt, using people as political props with taxpayer dollars. Where's the outrage on that? I see I'm out of time. I have more, but I'll yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Pfluger for 5 minutes of questioning.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. What we hear today is just a political theater at its very best. We're talking about the human tragedy, the human cost, the financial cost, the burden on farmers and ranchers, what you're seeing in Arizona, what we're seeing in New York City. Mr. Burley, you said about 65,000 illegal immigrants in New York City right now?
Correct.
That is 0.1% of the total amount of illegal immigrants that have come into this country under President Joe Biden's watch. 0.1%. And the mayor of New York is standing up saying, we can't handle this, we can't do this. I agree with the mayor on that point. He can't. He can't handle it. It was earlier said by Mr. Reichlin Melnick that he couldn't imagine anything, and I'm quoting here, there can't be anything worse than taking a child from a parent's arms. Did you say that today at this hearing?
Yes.
Okay, there can't be anything worse than taking a child from a parent's arms. 100,000+ children from the age of 18 into their mid-20s, early 30s, young adults, have died as a result of the poisoning of fentanyl this year. Does that count?
Congressman, fentanyl and migration
Does
are
that
two
count?
separate issues.
Does that count as taking a child from a parent's arms?
The
That's-
opioid
I don't have a
epidemic
que-
has
I don't have a
every
question.
family in this country. I
This
mean,
is
I
the,
think it's
I'm gonna reclaim my
very
time.
clear.
I'm gonna
It's a
reclaim my
problem.
time. I'm gonna reclaim my time. 100,000+. And yet we hear that the fentanyl issue is unrelated to illegal immigration. What a farce. I have no question for you. Thank you. Mr. Lyons, talk to me about the human trafficking issue in Arizona. Tell our colleagues on the other side of the aisle about a stash house where you have separation of children who are being molested, assaulted, raped, and tortured in Arizona.
We have across the border at Morelos Dam what many have called the rape tree. And while visiting that area with members of the Judiciary and Oversight Committee, we encountered medication that had been thrown to the ground the day after pill. And in speaking with some of those people that had been taken to Amberley's place and others taken into custody with Border Patrol, they had reported being violated multiple times. I spoke to a young man who had been sent back to Mexico multiple times, who was caring for his sister. His father died on the road, and he was prostituting himself in order to take care of his sister and her children. We have seen, and our Sheriff Leon Wilmot, who has testified before this committee previously, that 5,000 to 10,000 children are trafficked through Yuma. And this, in these numbers that we talk about, we don't even talk about those who are coming across the gotaways, those who are actually being smuggled across.
That's right. And yet this doesn't count, does it? This doesn't count for taking a child from their parents' arms.
If I may, Congressman, just speak to the fentanyl. Yuma and the border communities have a disproportionately high number of overdoses or poisonings. My wife, in visiting with one of her close friends at my home, called me 3 hours later. After her friend had left, she walked into her home and found her 18-year-old son suffering from a fentanyl overdose, and he died 2 days later. Our rate of fentanyl poisonings on the border is 19 times higher.
And 90% of the precursors are coming from China into Mexico, crossing the border, and yet we have people testifying today that are saying that it's unrelated to the crisis that we face. This crisis has cost Texas $5 billion last year, $5 billion this year, $9 to $10 billion next year. I have the sheriff of Ector County, Odessa, Texas, texting me right now saying that in July, 1,041 prisoner days due to illegal immigration were taken up in the Ector County Sheriff's Prison. That was just in July. You amortize that across the entire year, it's almost $1 million just on illegal immigration. We have a crisis at our southern border. I invite, once again, my colleagues from the other side of the aisle to join us and go down there and figure this out. And yes, H.R. 2 is the solution that we need. The president must stop this crisis at our border. He must end the absolute abuse, rape, and torture of these kids that's going on as a result of the cartels owning the southern border. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Goldman for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Borelli, I have a couple of quotes that I want to read to you, and let me know if you know who said them. First, quote, "Migrants get more attention and resources than any other group in the city, and we are just turning New York into the world's refugee camp." Do you know who said that?
Well, that sounds like me.
It was. Next, quote, "They seem to be on the whole an honest class, but they are continually brought before the courts for fighting, violence, and attempts at murder, crimes which arise from the crowded way in which they live and the jealousies and quarrels that would naturally arise from such a promiscuous mode of life. But the children, as they grow up, will naturally and inevitably form the criminal class of this city." Do you know what group of newly arrived immigrants that this quote referred to?
I would say 19th century immigrants, Italy, Ireland, maybe.
Italians. It's from an 1882 New York Times editorial about Italian immigrants coming to New York City, which were sadly reflective of a really disgusting common sentiment at the time. And you're a member of New York City Council's Italian caucus, right? Right?
Yes, sir.
Would you agree with that assessment of Italians as forming the criminal class of New York City?
No, sir.
And you have been fear-mongering on this issue, as have my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, about the, quote, criminals coming across the border. But you are aware, are you not, Mr. Borelli, that the amount of crime from the migrants who have arrived in New York City is far lower than the average crime rate in the city, correct?
I'm unaware of it, but I'll assume since you're saying it in public, it's true. Sorry, I don't want to cut you off, but I have a bunch I want to get through. And I think, you know, one of the things that frustrates us on this side of the aisle in New York City about some of your rhetoric, and I represent the district that includes the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island. My grandmother escaped anti-Semitism to come through Ellis Island, as so many of our forefathers did. The Statue of Liberty states, quote, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." And that is the New York way. New York City has always welcomed immigrants. Immigrants are what make that city the most dynamic in the country and have built its success. And we must welcome immigrants that are fleeing horrific conditions in their countries, in Central and South America. And I applaud the Biden administration for announcing a reinvestment into those countries to stabilize them and improve their economies. In your opening statement, you identify a lot of problems that we have, Mr. Borelli, very few solutions. But I want to ask you a couple questions about some solutions. You noted one of the migrants has an asylum date of 2033. You would agree that part of the problem that we have are asylum delays, is that right? Expediting court cases would be helpful, correct.
And would it be helpful to have more immigration judges to help expedite that backlog?
I assume part of that problem is the lack of judges.
Yeah. You've talked about, and we've all talked about, the problem with fentanyl and the cartels. In fact, my colleague from Texas just say that the cartels control the border and control the fentanyl trade. You would agree, would you not, that if the cartels did not have weapons of war, they would have less control over the border? Is that correct?
I don't know how they have control in Mexico, but I just met with the Office of Special...
So are you aware that they have a lot of guns?
The majority of the deaths in my district of drugs have trace amounts of fentanyl in it.
Right, so fentanyl's a problem, controlled, as my colleagues say, by the cartels, who have as much as 90% of their guns come from America. You would agree more visas, lawful visas would help, right? More than 50% of Fortune 500 CEOs are either immigrants or children of immigrants. If we had more lawful visas, that would reduce the amount of immigration coming across our border. And then finally, I just want to ask, the business community in New York City, as I'm sure you know, has come out in favor of granting migrants work authorization, right? Do you agree with that?
Work authorizations are certainly part of the solution, but it's unclear why we would have to prioritize people for work authorizations who have not followed the law thus far.
We don't need to prioritize it, but would you agree that those, would you agree, my last question, sir, would you agree that the 180-day waiting period should be reduced after someone applies for asylum to get a work authorization?
I would agree that there are work authorizations that could be granted for the thousands of people that you and I both represent, who have families waiting overseas, who have to date applied and follow
Exactly. The business, and just if I could wrap up, because my time's almost over, and that is correct. The business community wants people to work, and we want people to work. Every single one of those proposals I just mentioned are Democratic legislative proposals. None of them are included in H.R. 2 or any Republican proposals because they're not interested in solving the problem. They're interested in starving our border, starving our Department of Homeland Security so that it continues to fail for their political benefit. And I yield back. Thank you for your indulgence.
Yeah, I have tried to be fair to everyone on this regard. If you're going a little over, I'll continue to do that until someone really, goes beyond 6 or so minutes. But anyway. All right. I now recognize Mr. Garbarino for his time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Borelli, it's good to see you. I'm happy you were able to make it down here today and talk about what's actually happening in New York City. New York City is currently experiencing serious problems with poverty and homelessness, with low-income Americans who are just trying to get by. Has the New York City government diverted any public resources or spending away from low-income Americans to accommodate the illegal aliens arriving into the city?
Yes and no. It's not necessarily a reduction in spending, but it is a reduction in space. We have a homeless shelter, for example, that was approved for the North Shore of Staten Island, which was intended on serving a specific population of presumably U.S. citizens who are experiencing homelessness. That shelter is now under consideration for the migrant crisis, and we've seen that happen in numerous locations. Look, we've had a homeless problem in New York. I mean, that's not unique to this city. It's not unique to any city in America. What is unique is the unprecedented way we've adapted ourselves and how quickly we have. I mean, we've never leased hotels en masse to address homelessness in New York, so it's not necessarily a reduction of services. It's more finding the space and capacity to keep both populations in shelters. We had about 60,000 people in our homeless shelters prior to the migrant crisis. Now, when you add the migrants and the New York City homeless, it's somewhere around 100 and something thousand.
You just brought up the leasing of hotels. In June of 2023, city officials said that it cost $385 per night to provide shelter to an illegal alien family unit. New York City was spending almost $8 million a day. By August, it would given the more than 57,000 illegal aliens present in the city. Mayor Adams said the cost had ballooned to $9.8 million a day, which would be around $3.6 billion per year. With now it's, I think you said 65,000, the number's up to. How is the city covering these costs?
Well, with tremendous difficulty. Obviously, we have one source of revenue. It's the city's general fund, and if the money comes from the general fund and goes towards this purpose, it cannot be used to other purposes, which sounds pretty basic, but there seems to be some difficulty in understanding that at times. The bigger problem is that these costs have continued to grow over time as the number of people have continued to come in.
I want to focus on, I want to go back to the money comes from the general fund, and I want to focus on the other costs that are being cut. So, you know, the mayor announced possible 15% cut to all agencies. I think I read something about possible overtime for firefighters, cops, sanitation workers, correction officers, all being cut. Can you go into that a little more? Because the focus today's hearing is what this disaster at the border is costing Americans and specifically New York City residents, not just New York City residents, but a lot of my constituents out on Long Island go into the city for work. So, when there's less cops around, bad things can happen. So can you please just go into what the costs are for the citizens of New York City?
So this mayor, like many executives who govern cities and agencies, will look to cut essentially the easiest things first. So first to go in this case will be police and fire and sanitation, et cetera, overtime, because that's something we obviously issue on a weekly basis, on a daily basis to different people. The next thing that'll go is some contracted services for supplies, for goods, for things that each agency needs to perform their basic functions. Bigger picture items, though, the mayor hasn't released the list of what they're proposing yet, but in January of this year, facing just some minor budget headwinds, he listed cuts to the city university, cuts to pre-K programs, not filling 10,000 vacancies in the city workforce, cuts to the New York City Housing Authority, and cuts to supportive housing rental assistance programs.
New York state law also, I believe, requires once a school-age child is in a school district, are they required to provide education to that child?
Yes.
No. So that's another cost. I'm hearing it from my local superintendents on Long Island. They're getting hundreds of more kids in each school district, and they can't find the teachers, especially the English language learner teachers, to cover them. So there's going to be a huge cost there. And I only have a little bit of time left. Mayor Adams declared that half of all hotel rooms were being occupied by illegal aliens. New York City is they rely a lot of small businesses rely on the tourism that comes in. What's happening to the businesses, the business community, because people can't get rooms for tourism because they're taken up by the people who are here from the southern border. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, we've certainly seen some businesses complain and have problems. There was one published report about restaurants within some of these hotels going out of business and closing their doors. So there doesn't seem to be, at this point, any vibrant economic activity coming from this population.
I appreciate your answers. I'm out of time, but this perfectly, his testimony shows the cost that this is having on American citizens and on the city of New York and the state of New York. So thank you, Ms. Braley. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I believe this is now hearing number 11 on the border. We've had 7 at the full committee and 4 at the subcommittee level. Last week, it was titled The Unbearable Cost of the Border. The hearing before that was titled The Real Cost of the Border. And this week, it's the financial cost of the border. So over and over, we hear the same talking points, which in my opinion, and I think of many of my colleagues, distorts the facts. I also want to remind all of our colleagues that I'm not the only immigrant on this committee. There are actually immigrants on both sides of the aisle that came to this country in search of a better life, that we support. Certainly I do support fair immigration processes that really support human beings as people and look at immigrants and asylum seekers as the people that they are. We also, of course, have members on both sides of the aisle that are children of immigrants or that are grandchildren of immigrants and so on. That's who we are as a nation. It's who we've been for a very long time, people searching for a better life. And some of the same colleagues have often said at this committee and other places that their parents or grandparents came to the U.S. legally as immigrants, or they followed the rules, or they waited in line. And I think it's important to look at some of that history. For most of American history, we welcomed immigrants. We know that today, though, our system is very different and it's broken. We don't have workable legal pathways which make our border more secure and orderly. And I want to show you 2 posters behind me. This, of course, has been the traditional route that we've celebrated in our country, which was our inspection process getting through the border, arriving in New York, entering Ellis Island, medical inspection, legal inspection, admission, and Representative Goldman, of course, is very proud and talked about this, of course, in his remarks as well. And now I want to show us here the actual current process of going through the immigration process. This is where we're at today. This is an unfair, broken system in a process that now, and quite frankly, is cruel and we should be ashamed of in this country. Mr. Melnick, I want to ask you, do you think our current process is more or less complicated than it used to be?
Our current immigration process is extraordinarily complicated. The overwhelming majority of people in the world have no means to legally immigrate to the United States. People say, why don't they just get in line? The reality is there is no line. That's not a thing. You just can't come here easily. It's virtually impossible for most people.
And is this new process that we have more humane or less humane than we used to have?
I think that it's significantly more humane. The backlogs are extensive. Some Indian nationals, for example, have to wait over 100 years to get a green card.
Would you, in fact, call our immigration system today, of which seems, I mean, to me, seems very complicated, would you call this more cruel of a process than we used to have?
Certainly in the ways it can keep people separated from their families or keep them from being able to contribute to this country.
I want to just make a few other points. I want to first thank you, Mr. Melnick, for your work that you've done on immigration, which I think has been recognized across the country. I want to talk about our immigrants and refugees. Is it true that in 2019, refugees contributed $25 billion in taxes and an additional $68 billion in spending power? Isn't that correct?
That's right.
Is it also correct that that includes $20 billion in spending power for my home state of California? Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
The reality is that the labor force is essential to economic growth. We know this, and in 2022, immigrants directly accounted for approximately $3 trillion of U.S. GDP. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
And isn't it also right that refugees who are able to stay in the U.S. actually end up making upwards of $71,000 in household income, more actually, $4,000 more than U.S. median household incomes?
Yeah, over time, refugees end up earning more than the average immigrant.
The fact is that people who immigrate to this country are deeply grateful. We all know we're proud of it, which is why approximately 90% of all refugees who stay in the U.S. for 20 years or more try to become citizens here and plant their roots. This is why immigrants are also far less likely to commit crimes than native-born population, which is why, according to FBI crime data, crime in border communities was measured to actually be 15% lower than the national average. Again, crime in border area communities is 15% lower than the national average. We're not only a nation of immigrants, but also a nation built on the idea of the American dream. Now, this is a group who embodies the spirit of this country. Now, Mr. Melnick, I want to also make sure that I have these numbers correct. Is it true that 13% of refugees are entrepreneurs compared to over 11% of immigrants and just 9% of US-born Americans?
That's right. We know that refugees have one of the highest entrepreneurship rates of any group in the country.
So from 1995 to 2022, immigrants accounted for 49% of all of the civilian labor force, and immigrants and their children accounted for 70% of the total labor force. So for all of my colleagues who are hell-bent on scapegoating immigrants and refugees for their financial cost, let's remind everyone that the largest and most recognizable American companies were founded by immigrants or children of immigrants. Apple, Costco, Google. In 2019, 45% of all Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants or their children. 45% of all Fortune 500 companies. These American companies on the Fortune 500 generated $6.1 trillion with a T dollars in revenue. So I know that we're talking about the financial costs of immigrants, and I think it's very clear that immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers outperform American citizens even today as it relates to business growth, GDP, and economic output. So I want to thank you for your testimony, and I want to remind us that we should continue to be a nation built on immigrants because it's good for the American economy. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Ezell for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over the past months, this committee has exposed the lawlessness unfolding at our southern border. What we have not discussed is the burden the American taxpayer carries because of Biden's failed policies. And let me tell you, the drain on our financial resources is staggering. $151 billion is estimated the cost of illegal immigration to this country each year. That is billion with a B. And what's worse, the number's growing. As our national debt reaches $33 trillion, we can't afford to keep spending this much money when we know there is a solution. A recent DHS report estimated the cost of a physical border wall to be $20 billion. This is 1/8 of the yearly cost of illegal immigration in this country. This investment would pay off immediately and save taxpayers billions each year. Mr. Lyons, do you think building a physical wall at our southern border is a physically responsible decision?
That's one of the tools that we should utilize. And when Secretary Mayorkas was in Yuma, he made a commitment to Mayor Nichols and myself that he would fill 9 of the 11 gaps that we had in Yuma, and so far we have 3 that have been completed. But that was done with new material, not the material that had been previously purchased and laying within 50 yards of the new installation material.
As a former sheriff, I know the challenges of stretching every dollar we had in our budget to ensure the safety of citizens in my community. With a massive influx of illegal immigrants since Joe Biden took office, the financial stress is falling on states and local law enforcement to protect public safety and combat national security threats. For example, in your home state of Arizona, $20 million has been allocated to a border task force. When states are having to spend millions of dollars to combat illegal immigration, what strain does this put on the state and local budget to ensure safety?
Well, Arizona has been disproportionately affected as far as our state, local, and federal augmentation of implementing border security, and that state task force has done well to work along the corridors of the interstate, where they work with federal and local partners, our sheriff and other sheriffs, where they've been able to interdict the fentanyl. And those people who tend to bypass the safer areas and go straight across the desert, which is extremely dangerous. We also constructed a border wall out of Conex boxes, and that provided additional assurances directly around the city of Yuma, where we had people walking through fields and walking directly into homes or to other areas seeking assistance when Border Patrol was overrun and unable to take them in for processing.
Mm-hmm. Recently, the sheriff of a county on our southern border testified that border-related booking costs totaled $4.3 million in 2022. On top of this, over 1,500 suspects were booked into county jail for the border-related crimes. What are counties doing to afford these extra costs, and where are they finding the space to house these extra prisoners?
So in Yuma County, last year, fiscal year, our cost specifically related to the illegals that were detained was $1.3 million, of which I believe maybe we were reimbursed 10% or 10 cents on the dollar, I should say. But we continue to see other costs attributed to that as well. Especially our first responders, I apologize.
Exactly.
Who have to respond to 911 calls on the border, and most often people are just looking for a ride.
Your testimony today on what the farmers at the border are going through stuck with us. We hear stories of the toll this administration's policies are taking on every day in American lives constantly. What's frustrating, the Biden administration seemingly does not care. These illegal aliens aren't staying at the White House, they're flooding into your backyards. I wonder, Mr. Lyons, what do you think it'll take for the President and the Secretary of Mayorkas to take this problem seriously?
Well, first and foremost, a visit to the border would be in order. I appreciate Secretary Mayorkas being there. I appreciate the one-third commitment that he has fulfilled. However, we are still far short of what is needed. Aside from that, all of our surveillance equipment on the southern border has been removed that was previously installed. And so we have a completely open southern border with surveillance equipment having been removed.
Who removed that?
This administration.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Ms. Ramirez.
Thank you, Chairman.
Yep.
Generation after generation, our families have been coming to this country, crossing the ocean or the border. That's what I've been thinking about as I'm part of, I think he said, 11 hearings. Our families have been calling and seeking this American dream that got some of us here to Congress, most of us, unless we're Native American. And today, the hearing is about the economy, the cost of the border. I'm anxious to talk about the economy. As someone that ran a nonprofit working with people experiencing homelessness for many, many years, as someone in the state legislature who worked on balancing budgets, budgets are important to me. And generating revenue for our states is incredibly important to me. Just in Illinois, immigrants in Illinois, 17.3% of share of worker force is immigrants. 22.9% of entrepreneurs in Illinois are immigrants. 117,701 immigrant entrepreneurs. 2.8 billion total business income of immigrant entrepreneurs. We don't seem to complain about that revenue, right? 20.4 billion immigrant taxes paid. Yet what we know, we talk about the inflation a lot here, is that the US has a worker shortage. In Illinois, regardless of party, I have constituent businesses in manufacturing and hospitality. I have folks coming from downstate to my district and staying in agriculture. We need workers. 8.8 million job openings in the United States of America right now. Look, if you don't want to provide shelter for people, I'm gonna say this to you loud and clear. If we don't wanna do that, then let's join forces and request that we remove that 180-day bar so that people can work. Let me tell you loud and clear, because I actually have gone to some of these shelters. I've gone to police stations in Chicago. People wanna work. And this country needs workers. So if they work, they get their own apartment. If they get their own apartment, we don't have to provide shelter, and you certainly don't have to provide food. This is something that we can solve together. And it's why a number of us have asked the Biden administration to waive out that 180-day bar and let people work. Now, here's what I want to say. We have a broken immigration system. I think Mr. Reichlin
Melnick.
Say it again.
Reichlin Melnick.
Darn it, I lost 7 seconds. Thank you. You talked about the broken immigration system. 1990, the last time we did anything around immigration. I'm gonna tell you my age. I was 7 years old. 7 years old. The reason that my parents are US citizens today is because of 1990, because of 1986. This country would fall apart with immigrants. One day without immigrants, you don't eat. One day without immigrants, you don't have a hotel to stay in. One day without immigrants, our economy collapses. Honorable Borelli. Yet, we want to talk about how much they're costing us. Here's the thing. Work permits, immigration reform, and the adequate visa so that people don't have to come here illegally, these are all solutions that work to make this country the country of the American dream, the country of freedom, and the country of the future. So here's my question to you, Mr. Reichlin Melnick. How would reducing the time to get a work permit help asylum seekers, local communities, and American businesses?
It would help enormously. And of course, the obvious reason is that if somebody is here and they're in a shelter, they don't want to be in a shelter. As you said, you talk to these people, they'll tell you, I want to be out supporting myself. I want to be out helping. I want to be out helping my family. I don't want to be sitting here in a shelter, twiddling my thumbs and waiting for months and months to go by.
So if they work, will that address the work shortage we have in the US right now?
I think it will certainly help, but we definitely need broader immigration reforms to go along with that.
I agree. So here's the last thing I would say. This morning, I went to a detention center briefing, hearing about the impacts of people in detention. There was a woman from Chicago there. For about 15 minutes, as she bawled, and she's here with us right now, she talked about what happened to her at that detention center. And I heard one of my colleagues today said, instead of putting him in a hotel for $300, how about you put him in a detention center? How about you go to that detention center and you see what's happening there before you start sending women and children into detention centers? With that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. D'Esposito for his 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel of witnesses. Today, we focus on the historic dollar cost of the failed policies of Secretary Mayorkas. Mr. Borelli, you served time in the state legislature, now in the city council for the great city of New York. You mentioned during your opening remarks that in 2023, New York City will bring up a bill of $4.7 billion with a B to fund the migrants coming into New York City. It's estimated that in 2024, we're going to see a minimum of $6 billion spent on the migrants coming in to New York City. Some of my colleagues mentioned that that number is bigger than their entire state's budget. Recently it was announced, and I know that it was mentioned by my good friend from New York, Mr. Garbarino, about Floyd Bennett Field in Brooklyn. It has been chosen to shelter thousands of migrants. Do you know how much the city will be paying to lease Floyd Bennett Field from the federal government?
Yes, it's $21 million for the year, in addition to costs in terms of bringing infrastructure and other necessary items to the site.
So we're looking at about $1.7 million a month,
Correct.
plus whatever it costs to, put the migrant shelter in place on Floyd Bennett Field.
Right, that doesn't include the operating costs of the actual facility.
Now, obviously, you know that I served a career in the NYPD, and many of our specialty units call home to Floyd Bennett Field. Aviation, ESU, scuba. There is a Floyd Bennett Field Civil Air Patrol, Floyd Bennett Composite Squadron. There's the Marines 6th Communication Battalion. In addition to being a complete financial burden on New York City, as one of the few members of the City Council that actually stands with law enforcement, wouldn't you agree that this is a major security risk for not only the residents of New York City, but the millions upon millions that come visit annually?
Yes, and I know of many members and chiefs of the NYPD who are part of those units on that facility have raised some objections about the security now that would be present on the site. I don't know of the result of that since this lease has only been about a week old, but it is certainly a concern. It wasn't a concern, though, when we talked about Fort Wadsworth on Staten Island, which is the same situation, only it's an active military base where migrants would be, in theory, held.
Right, and I think what this shows, and it's very rare that Mayor Adams and I agree, but I do agree that this issue is going to destroy New York City. But what I also say is that the mayor touted the fact that New York City was a sanctuary city, but had absolutely no plans in place to actually serve as that sanctuary. Let's be very clear, when people cross this border, when people risk their lives, when people come into this country, they don't do it. They don't want to achieve the American dream living in a vacant hangar in JFK. That is not the American dream that they're coming here for. Staying on the subject, New York City has many departments. The ones that are probably most well known: the building department, sanitation, the FDNY, the NYPD, emergency management. Because of the financial burden, because of the historic costs that Mayorkas and the Biden administration are placing on New York City, the mayor, and whether I agree with it or not, you can't blame him because he's trying to find a solution to a problem, has called for a 5% reduction. Now, he wants to do that 3 times over the next 9 months, equaling 15%. In just 20 seconds, what do you think that's going to do to the city agencies that you oversee in New York?
You mentioned the fire department, the sanitation department, and the Office of Emergency Management. The burn rate of $10 million is more than we spend on all of that per day right now. So that's how much money in comparison to other city spending we're talking about. So there's no choice. It'll end up being, as we've been told already, the first thing to go will be overtime, which these agencies themselves are short-staffed as it is. So now you're going to reduce the man-hours for all of them across the board, essentially.
Right, so to the mayor's point that this issue is going to destroy New York City, it's not just housing the migrants, it's paying for the migrants, it's the historic cost. And people on the other side of the aisle, not here today, but have mentioned that Mayorkas has had an historic tenure. Mr. Chairman, the only thing that has been historic is the amount of narcotics coming over our southern border, the border crossings, the historic got-away numbers, the historic cartel criminal enterprises that are controlling our southern border, the historic failed operational control, the historic frustration, anger, and hopelessness from Customs and Border Patrol, and as we're focusing on today and what we've made clear, the historic dollar amount that Secretary Mayorkas and President Biden have cost this country. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Luttrell for 5 minutes. Mr. Luttrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, thank you for showing up today. I appreciate it. This has definitely been an interesting journey thus far. I do wish to say that and listening to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I couldn't be in, I agree in some things and I disagree in others, but at the end of the day, the polarization of the parties and the ugliness of the narrative that lives in this place is not allowing us to fix the judicial and the border security system. And I want everybody to hear me say that. Where I live, I'm a border district. I live far enough away from the border that it's the landing zone for the illegal immigrants that come across, and it's where they're positioning themselves. And I want everybody to understand, because I see this every day when I'm back home. It's not that. It is that when illegal immigrants land in a certain spot, especially with the numbers that I'm seeing. I have a county right next to mine that only touches 2 of my counties, and there's 50, and we're working on the exact numbers, but 50 to 100,000 illegal immigrants living in that area. 50 to 100,000 illegal immigrants living in that area. And what's happening is they're scuttling the economy. They're taking away the school districts. They've had to build 6 schools in the area just to teach and educate the children in the area. And we have to bring in members of the economy that speak Spanish, because the children do not. The brick and mortar areas that are in the facility are being scuttled. The gas, the sanitation for that many people, when they come in that fast, you can't quantify that. And I'm feeling that where I live. That's my issue with the system itself. Is like, if we don't, there was a young lady here not too long ago that sat there in front of all of us and said, "You are doing nothing." She said that to us. She lost her daughter. An illegal immigrant, a coyote, was running away from the police and hit her mother and her daughter and killed them both. This is the second time that she had been up here, and she looked at all of us. She's like, "You guys are doing nothing." And we should be. That's our job. And Mr. Borelli, I absolutely 100% disagree with you saying you need to send them back to Texas, buddy, because that's where I'm from. And we are feeling it. And the fact that you guys are having to share the pressures, it upsets me that that's having to happen. But my question is, Mr. Lyons, how much money annually do you think that are we spending on illegal immigrants? Not legal, because in my district, I need legal immigration. I have farming and ranching. My ranchers, my farmers, they need those individuals to come across and help them. But illegally, how much money, under the leadership that we see now, how much money are we spending annually for the American public?
Tens of billions.
Tens of billions.
Absolutely.
Give me an idea, if you will, because Mr. Borelli, you said 62,000. Did I see the people in New York City this year?
Correct.
62,000. Give me that number and what that looks like.
So 62,000 people are being basically given 202 hotels and about 8 or 9 given the day hercs, which are tent cities that are staged in parks, parking lots, and things like that.
And what my colleague on the other side said is, like, we looked, the previous administration, President Trump, they keep bringing his name up over and over and over again. And we're in a different administration now. And the problem to date is worse than it was previously and previously and previously. And that's just the numbers, okay? That is strictly sheer numbers. So, Mr. Melnick, I just offer this up to you as somebody who sees this every day, and I've seen the separation of families. I fought in 2 wars. Okay, so I respect exactly what you're saying. The immigration system, as broken as Mr. Garcia showed, that is almost impossible to read. They should lock the Judiciary Committee in a room and say, "We're not coming out until we fix the problem." Period. End of discussion. It should happen. But I want you to hear me say, for my people in District 8 of Texas, like, we're overwhelmed, we're underwater, and we're struggling, and we absolutely need help. And I can appreciate your perspective, but the ship has left the dock, all right? And I don't have any question for you per se. I just wanted you all to hear me say what I had to say. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Strong for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first want to talk about the cost of illegal immigration that the taxpayers in my district bear the burden of. It's estimated that this year alone, immigration will cost Alabama taxpayers $524 million. Illegal aliens throughout America are destroying economies, school systems, hospitals, law enforcement, first responders, court system, and jails. 20,288 border wall panels are being stored by this administration in 3 states rather than being installed. This is a failed process that has cost the taxpayers of America more than $300 million to store since 2012. This border fence, it should be installed immediately. If members of Congress support this administration's failed Southern policy, speak up and let your support be known. I feel more than confident that Governor Abbott will be happy to direct buses to your district, and let's see how 100,000 illegals destroy your community. President Donald Trump's been talked about several times. Let's just get one thing straight. His process worked. He processed and returned illegal aliens to the country of their origin. This administration created this southern border circus. Secretary Mayorkas continues to testify. He has operational control of the southern border. And every American understands that he is full of hot air. Our country is under attack at the southern border. They're coming from Cuba, Haiti, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Venezuela, Iran, and guess what? They're coming from China too, and that's just to name a few. America has become the world's dumping ground for illegal immigration. The Mexican cartel is flying 17 drones for each one flown by Border Patrol, delivering fentanyl. Drones are crossing through U.S. airspace, and Secretary Mayorkas does nothing. If he wants to jam these drones or he wants to drop them, I can tell you this, I've got multiple companies in my district that can neutralize this threat within a matter of weeks. Secretary Mayorkas continues to chew his fingernails and does nothing. Mr. Borelli, as my colleagues have mentioned, the cost to taxpayers in New York is a little higher. This year, it is projected that illegal immigration will cost New York taxpayers nearly $10 billion. This year has also seen record inflation, which has impacted every American family. What have you heard from those in your district about the rising cost? Is this more difficult for them to make ends meet?
Look, the cost concern is more about, for them, the city spending and the impact that migrant shelters have on their lives. We have a shelter that opened up in Staten Island a few weeks ago where the neighbor who owns a house has the showers for the shelter essentially abutting his backyard. On the cost side, we're starting to see that play out now. I mean, in truth, when this crisis first started, if this was 5,000 people or 10,000 people in a $107 billion budget, we wouldn't have even noticed that. Now we're seeing the downstream impacts on cost. We don't have the luxury that, with all due respect, my friends here in the federal government have to spend in deficit. So when we take, an apple from this jar, put it in the other jar, it has to come from somewhere else.
Who do you think they blame for that?
I think they blame President Biden 100%.
Mr. Borelli, low English proficiency students have a negative effect on classroom environments and education budgets because these students are often behind and cannot speak English. Additional school funding to compensate for the language barrier is often costly. In fact, it's estimated that it costs $10,000 a year to educate your average student in Alabama. When they are a LEP student, it costs approximately $6,000 more each year, and on top of that, an additional $4,000 if that student is also impoverished. So it costs about 100% more to educate these students. It's estimated that Alabama has about 31,000 undocumented students. I'll let you do the math and what this is costing our education system. Mr. Borelli, can you talk more about the impact on school budgets and what you're observing in your district?
Sure. So we have hired 3,500 teachers proficient in ESL. We have an additional 1,700 teachers that are certified bilingual. Part of the problem is that a lot of those teachers are bilingual in Spanish, and now we're seeing languages from other parts of the world where we may not have readily available services for them. The cost per kid in New York beats you by a significant dollar amount, it's $38,000 per student. And I would estimate that's very close to the actual cost because many of these students would be on the high end of the spending spectrum because they are coming with certain special needs. In many cases, they're not up to speed on third grade or fifth grade levels yet.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Crane for 5 minutes questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to everybody on the panel for showing up today. I want to start my comments with pointing out that Ranking Member Thompson in his opening remarks stated that this isn't a serious oversight hearing. It's just another dog and pony show. The focus and title of this hearing is the financial cost of the Mayorkas open border. Let's start with you, Mr. Lyons. Are the financial costs that Arizona citizens are having to cover serious to you?
100% every day.
Can you expound on that a little bit, sir?
Well, we've taken resources that could have been deployed elsewhere and put them towards border security. First and foremost, our border security task force, but then additionally down to from the state down into the counties, additional tools for their toolbox that they would be able to use in conjunction with Border Patrol after Border Patrol has had some of their tools removed.
Mr. Borelli, same question to you. Are the costs that New Yorkers are facing, are they serious?
Yes, they're the equivalent of up to 15% of our budget if the numbers play out the way they're expected to.
Are there members and citizens that you know of that are asking you, do you hear the chit chat, the talk, why isn't Congress doing anything about this? Do you hear that when you're at home, sir?
I certainly do.
Okay, so it is serious, right?
Correct.
So when you hear the ranking member on the other side say this isn't serious, this is just a dog and pony show, is there any wonder to anybody in this chamber why we can't solve this problem? They don't even think this is serious.
I don't know whether I'm the dog or the pony, but it is very serious to New Yorkers.
You know, I'd like to also point out that, Mayor Adams didn't seem to think this was serious either for a long time, did he?
No, and a part of me is very thankful that he has evolved and seen the light on a lot of the spending on this issue.
Me too. That's what happens sometimes when you face a lot of pain because of your own decisions and your own ideology. And I'm hoping the rest of my Democratic colleagues will wake up and realize it. I'm hoping this doesn't have to come to their state or their city or the district that they represent before they wake up. Because it is serious. It's costing the American people and our taxpayers a ton of money. And we're not even talking about all the kids that have died of fentanyl or all the lives and families that have been ruined that way, are we? That's not what we're talking about today, is it?
No, sir.
We're not talking about the crime, the MS-13 gang members that come in, destroy families and communities. We're not talking about that today.
No, sir.
There are costs, and my colleagues continue to talk about how many hearings that we've had on these subjects, and the sad thing is we have to continue to have these hearings because they don't get it. We keep saying it because they don't get it, and we keep saying it because we represent American citizens who are like, what is going on? Now they're seeing videos of illegal immigrants jumping on trains, and they know where they're coming, and they're terrified. Mr. Lyons, I know there's been some issues down in Arizona and specifically in Yuma with the hospital down there, and just how this situation has really burdened the health system down there. Can you go into that, sir?
We have seen surges that have resulted in large numbers of people being taken directly to Yuma Regional Medical Center. We have seen women approaching the border in labor. I've witnessed that multiple times, to the point where our emergency room and our maternity ward was overrun. We have one local hospital that is a community hospital. It's a land grant hospital with a board, and they have disproportionately borne a cost of more than $26 million that has not been reimbursed.
Thank you. You know, it's interesting to me, not only we talked about the the fact that my colleagues don't even think this is serious, that this is just theater. But I also want to point out that out of one side of their mouth, they'll say, hey, we want to help you solve this problem. And then several of my colleagues on the other side went along to say, but we need to continue to welcome these folks into the country, and then pointed out all the economic benefits that come with them. Did you guys notice the difference, how they're talking out of both sides of their mouth, like, hey, we want to help you solve the problem, but it's really not a problem, it's actually a benefit. Mr. Borelli, did you notice that at all?
I did. I mean, we've talked about work authorizations, which may be a solution for the population, but it's not a solution if the next group of people can come tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. If there's no stopping of the problem coming to our city, the issuing of work authorizations and permits won't resolve it.
Mr. Lyons, did you notice that?
Absolutely. I think that first and foremost, because this is the Committee on Homeland Security, we need to secure the border, and then we can start talking about lawful immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Lyons. Thank you, Mr. Borelli. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields, and I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questioning. In earlier hearings this year, I referred to the observation from a reasonable man's perspective that our nation has suffered a generational trauma brought upon our citizenry by the Biden administration policies as enacted and executed by Secretary Mayorkas. I stated at the time it would be difficult to measure just how significant the impact would be. I reflected upon the possibility that in the coming decades, America would be seen as that this was sort of a dividing era between a level of success and prosperity of our nation and the impact of the Biden administration policies at the southern border, that Americans 10, 20 years from now would speak of what America was like before President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas, and then what was America like after President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas. And I believe those observations are accurate. I didn't imagine at the time it could get worse, gentlemen. But in our research on this committee and in my constant communications with officials and boots on the ground throughout Central and South America, and in observing the expansion of the Biden administration border policies all the way through Central America and into South America, to see the CBP-1 app twisted from its original intention to allow for what they refer to as legal pathways into our country, and have processing pushed down into Panama, Guatemala, in Colombia, to see the thousands upon thousands upon thousands of human beings sucked into the vacuum of this policy, into an incredibly treacherous and deadly pipeline run by cartels to feed the disintegration of our sovereignty that was established by the Biden administration. Let me just say that I expand upon my original observation. The Biden administration and Secretary Mayorkas, as his Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, directly responsible for executing the policies and agenda of the president, they brought generational trauma upon the entire Western Hemisphere. It's impossible to measure. There's no matrix that could fulfill what this hearing is designed to investigate and reveal: the historic dollar costs of Mayorkas' open border, the healthcare costs, hospital and emergency services costs, the law enforcement costs, the financial burden imposed on cities and towns across the country, the cost to ranchers, farmers, and border industries. The list goes on and on. I think it's impossible to measure. at this point what the true and deep financial impact of the last 2.5 years will be upon our nation and the citizens we want to serve. Mr. Lyons, I would ask you to address the observations that I've shared, sir, and perhaps your own perspective.
I love my small community that I live in. One of the challenges that we face if we do not secure this border is a rise in the criminal element directly to our south and east. The New Generation Cartel is in control of that area. They prosper. They charge anywhere from $8,000 to $60,000 for somebody to cross the border. And while they are charging for these people and sometimes holding them hostage until their families pay more, as has been reported by the mayor of San Luis Rio, Colorado, the violence continues to rage where we've had over 350 assassinations in that area. 2 days ago, they attempted to arrest the chief of police in San Luis Rio, Colorado by the military because of some of the challenges surrounding this specific item of illegal immigration and control of narcotics coming across. It won't be long until this spills into our country, and it has been, and the situation continues to rage out of control.
I thank the gentleman, and I thank our panelists for being here today. My time has expired. I now recognize my colleague and my chairman when I came into this committee 7 years ago, Michael McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been in this game for a while. I was a federal prosecutor, U.S. attorney in Texas prior to Congress, and we had this problem. 20 years in Congress, chaired this committee. We finally had it under control. And this is the thing that gets me the most, is that we finally had an administration that dealt with the magnet that pulls in the people that the drug cartels manipulated, and that's political asylum. So how did that work? Well, my first bill in Congress was to end catch and release. And we pretty much ended it. And you know how we did it? We didn't allow them to enter the United States. They had to remain in Mexico pending the adjudication of their claim. And it worked. And the cartels are smart. They get our laws. But on day one, when this president rescinded that policy, as I asked Ortiz, the Border Patrol chief, was there a direct cause and effect between that change in policy and what you're now seeing? Now we're up to 5.8 million encounters in just 2.5 years. What are we going to do with 5.8 million people that have no legal status in this country, that are going into criminal enterprises? The biggest human trafficking event of my lifetime, sex trafficking. The girls are going to sex trafficking. The boys are going to MS-13. The healthcare costs in my state alone of Texas is skyrocketed. And now, sir, it's hitting your state, New York. Not to mention, you mentioned these assassinations and the death, the fentanyls, 100,000 people dead, the young generation. That's more than Vietnam over 2 decades. For God's sakes, I believe in accountability. And this administration is aiding and abetting. And they're complicit with this criminal activity, this criminal enterprise. So first, Mr. Borelli, I want to ask you this question. You're a councilman. You know, there's a federal statute. I was a federal prosecutor. 18 U.S.C. Section 2A states, whoever commits an offense against the United States or aids, abets, counsels, commands, induces, or procures its commission is punishable as a principle. Do you believe that Secretary Mayorkas has been aiding and abetting the entry of aliens who have no legal basis to be present in the United States?
Somebody certainly is. They're coming on buses provided by some NGOs or government entity, so there's certainly someone aiding these folks in coming to New York.
Well, do you believe this administration is aiding and abetting?
Sure. I think to your point earlier about the big picture, this administration ran on changing border policy. They came in February, say roughly of 2021. They made changes, and now, almost 2 years later, we can unequivocally say things have gotten absolutely worse, not just for New York, but it sounds like for a lot of the rest of the country.
And my state's borne the brunt of it. You have children arriving in your state, the sex trafficking, the forced labor camps, the gangs like MS-13. Again, do you think this administration has been aiding and abetting that criminal conduct?
Is that question for me or?
This is for you, sir.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I know of one migrant shelter facility in Brooklyn that has reached out to me for assistance in getting new security measures at their migrant shelter, specifically facial recognition technology to keep people who are affiliated with gangs out of the shelter.
And Mr. Lyons, I know your county has, just like in my state, the ranchers tell me they're ripping my property. I wake up in the morning and get a cup of coffee and there are dead bodies on my property. They trash my property. The agriculture, you got Arizona's native plants, which are under state law are protected, and they are completely disrespecting property. Do you believe that this administration has been aiding and abetting that?
Yes. Yes, sir, I do.
And what I think is worse, you mentioned 350 assassinations in Yuma County.
Across the border.
Across the border.
Directly across the border.
Within
1 mile of the border.
In Arizona.
In Arizona.
Could you elaborate on that? And the same question, do you believe this administration has been aiding and abetting that criminal conduct?
We have 3 cartels that are vying for control of trafficking, both human trafficking and both trafficking of narcotics and illicit goods that are coming across the border. And we've seen a significant rise in that crime where they've targeted elected officials and law enforcement in those areas to take them out so that they can maintain control. Border Patrol has engaged with some of those people directly on the border. Last Christmas, they dispatched one individual who was attempting to kidnap one young woman directly off of the border and take her back to Mexico. And the mayor of San Luis recently announced that he had liberated several groups of people who were being held by the cartel until their families in 30 different countries sent more money to them so that they could cross the border.
And who enabled the cartels to do this?
Well, I would suppose that if we're not engaging in an active basis, that it has to be this administration.
Thank you, sir.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman, Mr. Menendez is recognized for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, Chair. Less than a week ago, I traveled with Congressional Hispanic Caucus colleagues to visit New York City facilities that process, house, and serve migrants, as well as met with the mayor's office and nonprofits who work on the ground. One of the solutions I heard time and time again is the need to reduce unnecessary barriers to work authorization for asylum seekers. It's unconscionable to me that we sabotage asylum seekers from the start. We prohibit them from working for at least 6 months and then complain if they aren't immediately self-sustaining. It's cruel and it prevents migrants from contributing to our economy at a time when we're experiencing significant labor shortages across industries. Mr. Reichlin-Melnick, in addition to reducing the statutory 180-day wait period, how can we improve wait times for asylum seekers who are pursuing work authorization?
Well, the administration needs to invest more funding into work permit authorization adjudication requests at USCIS. We've actually requested significant backlog reduction funding at the agency. It is a fee-funded agency, so generally speaking, that means immigrants are paying for it. But the agency's been underwater for years and it was hit badly by COVID, so we really need Congress to step in on that.
Correct. As we heard in testimony this morning, immigration is central to our economic vitality, to the economic well-being of every American. Yet instead of recognizing the transformative potential of immigration to galvanize our economy, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are proposing options that would stifle immigration. Mr. Reichlin-Melnick, you've advocated for expanded legal pathways for immigrants of all kinds. This committee often talks about challenges at the border. How would expanding legal pathways impact the trends that we see at our southern border?
I think the best example of this is what we've seen with Haitian migrants at the border. I mean, everybody remembers what happened in September 2021 in Del Rio when 14,000 people crossed in a 48-hour span. In July of 2023, 19 Haitian migrants crossed the border illegally between ports of entry, 19 total. And that's because Haitian migrants have been given alternate legal pathways. The Haitian parole program, access to the ports of entry through CBP-1, that has almost completely stopped that population from crossing the border illegally. And it's a fantastic natural experiment that shows alternate pathways work.
Great, I appreciate that. Each hearing, it strikes me that among other missed opportunities that result from the politicization of these hearings, we're foregoing the opportunity to be forward-thinking. There are longstanding issues with our immigration system and border policies that prevent us from recognizing the full economic potential of our immigrant communities. As a result, we're forced to focus on short-term changes that address the symptoms rather than the causes. Many of these short-term solutions are critical, such as increasing access to work authorization, but would be failing in our duties if we did not also have hard discussions about comprehensive immigration reform. Mr. Reichlin-Melnick, my question has two parts. First, what short-term solutions should Congress prioritize to address the most pressing border challenges and pave the way towards meaningful immigration reform?
I think the first thing is providing people alternate pathways and working on flooding money to the ports of entry for processing. This is a dual impact because the ports of entry can be places where people can enter safely without the cartels having to be involved. So we can kick the cartels out of the loop. And secondly, because the ports of entry need infrastructure for fentanyl screening, because that's where the majority of fentanyl enters the country. And so if we can really kill two birds with one stone here, we can solve a public health crisis and a border crisis at the same time if we get resources to the agencies to process people more quickly. But we're not going to solve this overnight, so we need to focus on short-term solutions that get us to the long-term solutions.
I appreciate that. The second part of the question, how should we restructure our immigration system to optimize both the humanitarian and economic benefits of immigration?
Well, certainly getting rid of unnecessary and counterproductive work permit adjudication, work permit rules is one part of it, but we really need to rethink our current processing system. Our humanitarian protection system dates back to 1996 from a totally different border and a totally different world. We've got a 20th century system. It is a 21st century global humanitarian displacement crisis, and we really need to think about what that looks like in the modern world and not the world of 1996.
Appreciate that. Last question. Republicans have repeatedly demonized NGOs for providing support to migrants who have come to our southwest border fleeing horrific conditions. Their H.R. 2 bill punishes NGOs that provide basic care and support to children and families. It would bar DHS from providing funds to NGOs such as Catholic Charities, Episcopal Migration Services, and other nonprofits. Mr. Reichlin-Melnick, you have seen the important work NGOs do in supporting migrants. Can you explain how NGOs play a critical role in these border communities and throughout the United States?
Yeah, you know, a decade ago, we saw street releases as a common thing that happened all the time because there wasn't the kind of cooperation between the Border Patrol and NGOs like we have today. Now, street releases are rare. They do happen in times of high arrivals, but they are not something that happens all the time. And we've seen Border Patrol agents even come in front of this committee and talk about how vital that collaboration is between NGOs and CBP. So without that collaboration, you would have people released on the streets nearly every day. You'd have people stuck at the border, not figuring out where to go. It really helps reduce the chaos to the system to have a public-private partnership.
I agree. One of many fatal flaws of H.R. 2. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Ms. Green for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Reichlin-Melnick, I'm not sure what country you're paying attention to, which border you're paying attention to, but for your information, there are thousands of illegal immigrants, illegal aliens being mass released onto the streets of Arizona. Isn't that right, Mr. Lines?
Yes, they recently announced yesterday that we would start seeing those in my home community of Yuma, where they're already doing it in Tucson and other border communities.
Yeah, it's not rare. It's
No.
It's not something that just occasionally happens. Where a few of them, excuse me, I reclaim my time. where a few of them get released. As a matter of fact, it's being reported this morning. According to the Border Patrol, there were 9,300 migrant encounters at the border in the last 24 hours. That's 45,000 encounters in the last 5 days. Mr. Borelli, can New York take on just another 45,000 more illegal aliens?
No, I think financially and due to space concerns, the inn is full.
Mr. Lyons, can Arizona house some more of these people and feed them and educate them?
Right now, Tucson is now shipping some of these people back into Yuma, and Yuma does not have any facilities, nor do we have homeless shelters for these people because their facilities are full.
And if you ask any American citizen who is, by the way, we're in $33 trillion in national debt now, I don't think we can afford to pay for this. We heard Mr. Luttrell tell you, Mr. Borelli, that he doesn't want to take back the illegal aliens from New York, and Texas doesn't want them either. I have a pretty good idea. How about Remain in Mexico? Mr. Borelli, would you go along with Remain in Mexico?
It certainly seems like before January of 2021, this problem was a lot less significant for places like New York.
Absolutely. Remain in Mexico worked. Mr. Lyons, how do you feel about illegal aliens remaining in Mexico?
We saw 1/20th of the challenge that we're seeing today because of that MPP protocol to remain in Mexico.
Seems like it works. Ms. Maliatakis, you're from New York. How do you like Remain in Mexico?
I think it's a good idea. It certainly worked under the previous administration.
Yeah, it worked, but somehow under the Biden administration, this no longer works. Mr. Reichlin Melnick, last year on April 6, 2022, you tweeted that you were at the border last week with your 97-year-old grandfather, which is really nice. It's nice to be able to spend time with your grandfather.
Should be watching today.
You said it was a lovely day out. You said you did some bird watching, drove through the mountains, and had a great afternoon. You said there was no tragedy, no invasion, just normal life, and that border communities are some of the safest in the country. Yet, in April 2022, there was a record recorded by Border Patrol of 235,000 encounters. Are you aware of that?
I'm aware of the numbers, and I stand by my statements that border communities are some of the safest and best communities in the country, as I'm sure my fellow panelists would agree.
Well, the week that you were there with your grandfather on April 3rd, 2022, 72-year-old Perry Adrian Cole was killed by an illegal alien in an 8-vehicle crash that the illegal alien caused. So do you consider that safe and good for the border communities?
It's undoubtedly a tragedy, but again, data shows that undocumented immigrants, on average, commit fewer crimes than native-born citizens.
Like, how would 20-year-old Kayla Marie Hamilton's mother feel about that? She was raped and strangled to death by an illegal MS-13 gang member who was apprehended at the border before being released into the interior of the United States. I think her mother would disagree. I think you should also understand that in the year of 2020, the U.S. Border Patrol criminal non-citizen arrest was all the way down to 438. That's from in 2016 when Obama was president, from 12,842. I'd inform you today that we are over 12,000 again under the Biden administration. Again, that's Border Patrol criminal non-citizen arrest. Mr. Lyons, are border communities safe, lovely places with no crime and good for families and communities?
We've had 106 different countries cross into Yuma community, with 17 being from special interest countries where they've apprehended multiple criminal elements coming across the border.
Should Arizona pay for that?
Absolutely not.
Mr. Borelli, should New York pay for this?
No, ma'am.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. Ivey for 5 minutes. Or Mr. Correa, I'm sorry. Y'all keep sneaking in on whomever.
Chairman, flip a coin. Flip a coin.
You go ahead, Mr. Correa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to say that my colleague has a point about New York. in the 40, 50,000 individuals that are coming in. But look at it this way, if you gave them a work permit, could New York use 40 or 50,000 workers right away?
Well, New York's unemployment rate is twice the national average. So while I'll certainly accept that there's many businesses and companies that could use more workers, it's unclear why.
But they could probably use them. And the reason I'm bringing this up is, you know, this last weekend, I met a young lady who's undocumented, working in my district. She's been in my district 29 years. She got here when her daughter was born, about 30 years ago. You know what her job is right now? She's taking care of a 98-year-old widow, single widow. Her husband died in World War II. She's there. And this widow has nobody else to take care of her in her life. And I bet you that scenario is repeated over and over again. I've got a worker, I've got a factory in my district. They make some kind of electric connectors. The guy just brought back a bunch of work from China to the US, creating jobs. When he told me that ICE threw an audit at him and he had to let half his workforce go. Half his workforce gone means he can't comply with the US contract. We have an interesting situation in this country. Mr. Chair, as you know, just reported this morning that Mexico is now our biggest trading partner. Mexico exports more to the US now than any other nation in the world. That's part of the reason is that they're our neighbors, but also our public policy of focusing more business in the Americas as opposed to China. That's a national interest perspective. We've got a lot of things going across the border. When you talk about cost of the border, immigration, okay? We forget the jobs that are needed to be filled. You know, HR2, some of my colleagues right now are trying to get HR2 into part of the deal without E-Verify in it. The reason you don't want to put E-Verify is because you acknowledge that if you put E-Verify in, every firm that hires a worker that may be undocumented, they're going to be criminals. And you're going to make them choose between keeping that undocumented worker or going out of business or becoming a criminal. You know, I like both sides of the aisle here to get together and figure this out because this is about American national policy, economic policy, and national security. I had a meeting this morning with Guatemalan business people coming here to the Capitol, meeting with us, members of Congress, saying, we want into the North American miracle. We want to be part of the American miracle, and we want to start working with you to hold off China and Russia in our area. We are not listening to what these allies are asking us to do. They don't want freebies. They want to work with us. They want to trade with us. So, you know, California, you know, New York doubled the unemployment rate, national average has got to be 3.2, 3.4. And full employment is what, 5%? We have inflationary issues. We don't have enough workers. This 98-year-old lady has an undocumented worker taking care of her. That story repeats itself over and over and over again. We should just be truthful to ourselves and say, refugees, people here 30 years, are here because the jobs are here. And also they can't stand it at home either. We create a public policy, both sides of the aisle, recognizing what the challenges are for this hemisphere. Forget the rest of the world. I know the refugees around the world, Italy's screaming, Europe is screaming. Focus on our Western hemisphere. What's a good public policy that'll keep America strong? Because at the end of the day, these refugees is not about the refugees. Refugees are about America and keeping the American economy, the American economic miracle moving forward. So, you know, I offer my colleagues, let's sit down and talk, figure out a good farm policy, get those farm workers here, get those manufacturers here. Let's make it happen. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
The gentleman yields, and as I understand, we're going to need to take a break for our witnesses to take a quick break, bathroom break. So we will reconvene in 6 minutes at 10 after, or Let's do 15 after and give you guys plenty of time. So we will reconvene at 15 after. The committee's in recess. Is this your? Committee will come to order. I now recognize Ms. Lee for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this important hearing, and thank you to all of our witnesses for joining us here today. This preventable border crisis is costing taxpayers billions of dollars each year, while schools and hospitals are overwhelmed by a surge of illegal migrants. Last year in Florida, the healthcare cost for illegal aliens was nearly $340 million, with taxpayers footing more than 2/3 of the cost. As we've heard in prior hearings, this crisis is about even more than just the bottom line financial effect. It is a crisis of humans. It is a crisis of human loss. We've heard testimony about human trafficking, unnecessary deaths from fentanyl poisoning. A recent Florida grand jury investigation into this administration's policies established that since January 2021, approximately 165,000 unaccompanied children nationwide have been given to someone who is not their parent or legal guardian. Approximately 90,000 have been turned over to someone who claimed to be a family member without DNA testing and without adequate verification. About 30,000 have been surrendered to someone with whom they have no known relation. I spoke to my local sheriff's office in anticipation of today's hearing to ask how this crisis at the border is affecting our local community in Florida. And I learned that our county sheriff's office in Pasco County was forced to create 2 major crime squads solely for investigating overdoses. These squads are comprised of 5 deputies and cost over $1 million annually. I am so grateful for their work to combat this epidemic, and I recognize how difficult it is to perform these additional tasks and respond to these additional calls without the necessary resources. The human and economic toll of the border crisis is felt in communities across America. Mr. Lyons, on that subject, I'd like to turn to you. You've already touched a bit on the impact that illegal immigration is having on police departments, especially in rural areas. Would you expand on how the increase in 911 calls in response to incidents related to those crossing the border is affecting your resources and your ability to perform your duties?
We've seen a significant uptick in people who come to the border who do not want to wait. And sometimes they've had to wait up to 24 hours during the biggest surges, sometimes 36 hours. We've seen them order Uber Eats, but most particularly in order to expedite their removal from the border into a facility so that they can, quote unquote, get where they're going, they resort to calling 911, which ties up our system. And everyone in our 911 system must respond. So you have a tribal shared a 911 responder or first responders that will respond, then San Luis responds, or the city of Yuma, and then we have Rural Metro, which is a contract. And those have tied up resources so that they have been unavailable, especially during the height of our season when we have a significant uptick in visitors from the northern United States and Canada being in Yuma, and also our agricultural workers. And they are responding to calls that are not medically related. It's simply with people who want to be removed from the border.
And have you heard any stories of other places in the country that are similar to what I shared about Pasco County, where local law enforcement is being forced to expend additional resources and deputies or officers to respond to the fentanyl crisis?
Yes, absolutely. And in Yuma County, with Amerly's Place, we just received a grant from Arizona Department of Emergency Management where we are able to go out with 2 different agencies. It's a $500,000 grant and focus on human trafficking along the border specifically, but through Operation Stone Garden, which is federally funded, and we very much appreciate Operation Stone Garden. Our state and local law enforcement are able to put additional resources out into the field to go after those that are trafficking fentanyl. And it's interesting, a side note, when we see the numbers dip in people coming across, they tend to have the ability to interdict more fentanyl because they are focused on border security and national security at that time rather than processing.
You also mentioned in your testimony the effect that the border crisis is having on healthcare and hospitals. Would you expand for us on the effects you see on hospitals?
We have one hospital that serves our community, and every day when I wake up, I am interested to see who is texting me during the night and what they've had to do because they haven't been able to access our hospital. I had several people tell me that they had to travel to San Diego or to Phoenix to deliver their baby or to have regular surgery that had been scheduled that had been put off. So we had an 18-month period where it was almost impossible to go into the hospital. Which also detracted from Border Patrol's ability to man the border because you have to stage a Border Patrol person, officer, with an individual who is at the hospital. And so for every 20 or 30 people that were in the hospital, those were agents that were there guarding them and not being able to be on the line.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. Ivy for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me apologize. I've been running back and forth between this committee and the Judiciary Committee.
We totally understand. It's been everybody's day today.
Yeah, we're going to have a lot more of these. Apparently, we've scheduled, the chairman scheduled a hearing for impeachment next week. So, on Judiciary, yeah, so we'll see what happens with that. But it is relevant to what we want to talk about today, which is the challenges that we're facing, in part because the Republican caucus is having difficulty sort of figuring out what it needs to do. So we've got a government shutdown looming, and we've got impeachment proposals with respect to President Biden that apparently was an effort to appease the right wing of the House Republican caucus, but fell flat because it was rejected. And by the way, there's no evidence to support an impeachment of President Biden anyway, nothing even remotely approaching high crimes and misdemeanors. But one aspect of that is the proposed CR that the House Republicans have floated. And it hasn't been adopted yet. I don't know that it will because it's got riders in it that are inappropriate and should not be included. And I don't think the Senate or the White House are going to accept some of the provisions in here. But the big piece I want to talk about with respect to this hearing is that if it went through as written, it would lead to over an 8% cut with respect to border funding. And that impact would include things like 800 fewer customs and border protection agents and officers, which could result in an additional 50,000 pounds of cocaine, 300 pounds of fentanyl, 700 pounds of heroin, 6,000 pounds of meth, and other aspects of that. With respect to the customs and border agents, one of the things we actually had a hearing about that we discussed and actually discussed when we went to the border was the challenges that border agents are facing. Many of them are facing mental health issues, depression because they're being overworked. Of course, understaffing them even further would have an even greater impact. And if there's a government shutdown, which apparently is looming too because the House Republicans can't avert that by passing basic legislation to keep the government running, what that would mean is even if you treated the border agents as essential personnel, they would still be left with covering the administrative functions that non-essential personnel wouldn't be there to do. And that would mean that they'd be more stressed and stretched even thinner than they currently are. I missed part of the hearing. I did come in time to hear one of my Republican colleagues mention drones. That's one of the things we saw when we went to visit the border. The Border Patrol agents talked about the fact that they are outgunned from a drone standpoint by the cartels on a 17-to-1 basis. One of the things that we pushed for to include in HR, well, we didn't want HR 2, but just to make sure they got the funding to increase the number of drones that they have on our side so the Border Patrol can deal with the issue of drones in a way that keeps pace with what the cartels are doing. Unfortunately, the funding to get that done has gotten held up by the Republican caucus here, and again, its inability just to do basic governing. I'm running short on time. I did want to cover a couple of other quick things now, though, as well. I think it's important to make sure that as we go forward on this, and I know we've got differences about things like the wall. The wall's another aspect of this. In H.R. 2, it requires 900 miles of additional miles of the wall to be built. The estimates I've seen is that that's around $20 million a mile. that's an additional $18 billion on top of the needs that would be needed here, even though the Republicans, as this current CR has proposed, would be cutting the budget that was proposed previously and reducing the number of resources that are available. Finally, I just want to say this before my time runs out. We've talked a lot about trying to find ways to have comprehensive immigration reform. I know I've got Republican colleagues that don't believe in that now. They just want to move forward with particular pieces. But one aspect of this that we really need to address in short order is the amount of assault weapons that the United States is sending down to Mexico. We are the gun providers for the Mexican cartels, the Sinaloa cartel in particular. By the way, DOJ just busted the son of El Chapo in a big takedown, so hopefully that'll continue to move forward. Although we've got Republican colleagues who want to cut the Department of Justice, the FBI, and ATF, including some who are members of this committee. I kind of wonder how you're going to be successful in prosecuting something like the Sinaloa cartel if you don't have an FBI or an ATF or a Department of Justice. But man, can we stop sending the guns that they're using against us, basically, to run these cartels? 600,000 a year. I know we got trouble doing anything with respect to addressing gun violence here in the United States, but it seems like we ought to be able to find a way to deal with that piece. That's not a Second Amendment piece. It's a challenge to the United States that hurts us from a Homeland Security standpoint. Can't we at least come together and find a way to deal with that? And with that, I yield back to the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields, and we recognize our last member, Ms. Maliotakis, who has waved on to the committee. And happy birthday. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
I know where this rumor came that it's my birthday, but I'll take it. I first want to thank you all for coming here today to speak with us. Obviously, a lot of members have already highlighted the immense amount of human, sex, drug trafficking that's taking place, the fact that the cartels are making billions of dollars annually off of this human trafficking, the fentanyl that are killing Americans, which brings me to the question about vetting. Mr. Lines, we know that there are 1.6 million gotaways. That's the estimate that the Customs and Border Protection have given us. And that means they had zero interaction with our government or law enforcement. Can you talk about the concern you have of what their intentions are, who they are, where they are, number one? And number two, can you let us know what the vetting process is right now?
I think that's the primary concern for all law enforcement, and every time I have the opportunity to sit down and visit with them, which is probably every other day, or the sheriff will text all throughout the night, that's their number one concern. The National Sheriff's Association, the Southwest Border Sheriffs all share that same concern. Who are they and where are they going? These are people who come in the middle of the night, who cut fences, who climb fences, and they have no idea where they are and what they're doing. I sit here next to a member from New York, and I'm honored to do so. It's interesting that some of the checkpoints were shut down in Yuma, which are along the interstate, and we had a lot of the 9/11 hijackers travel through from Tucson over to the San Diego area, and if those checkpoints would have been in place, they would have been able to catch them.
The ones that are interacting with the government, those other 6-7 million, how are they being vetted, and are they being properly vetted?
They are vetted with limited resources because they have to try and contact the country of origin to determine who they are. Not all of the countries participate in that vetting, and so you're basically taking their word for it. Along the border, as we walk along, you see all of their IDs thrown away. Most people are seeking to distance themselves and reestablish themselves here in the United States as a new person, and we have thousands of IDs that they've thrown away.
So it's your opinion that the individuals coming to New York City are not being vetted properly?
No.
Okay. Mr. Borelli, regarding New York's sanctuary policy, there was a law put in place that had kicked immigration and custom officials from Rikers Island after people are arrested. They no longer cooperate with detainer requests. Is that correct?
Yes, that was 2014.
So there's zero cooperation right now to deport individuals who are arrested. And we know that at this Roosevelt Hotel in Manhattan, there have been dozens of people already arrested. Are they being put back in that facility?
For the most part, yes, if they're not issued bail on spot.
Because of New York State's bail law, so they get arrested, they're not even going to jail, they're being released back onto the street, and the taxpayers are paying to have them housed in this luxury hotel. Is that what you're
Correct, and we've seen arrests at the Roosevelt Hotel and other sites when police have made enforcement actions against everything from domestic violence to illegal mopeds and scooters.
Okay. New York City has a non-citizen voting law. I pulled that up here, and the language says that people would be eligible to register to vote if they are a lawful permanent resident or authorized to vote in the United States and have been a resident for 30 consecutive days or less. So if the work authorization that my colleagues are pushing for were enacted, these individuals would be registered to vote after just residing in New York City for 30 days.
Correct. Thankfully, we both are plaintiffs in a lawsuit that is in the process of ending that policy.
Okay. And I got a question for our friend here who seems to be a big advocate of the open borders. I received, on behalf of a constituent, I will tell you, my office has helped hundreds of people who have come the right way, followed the rules, did everything right, have been waiting in line, become either citizens, green card holders, or get work authorization. Right now, the US CIS sent us an email saying that they're prioritizing applications that have been pending 21 days or less. And all other pending affirmative asylum applications will be scheduled for interviews starting with newer filings and working back to older filings. I have constituents that have been waiting for years to be heard in the court. Do you think that is fair, that individuals who are coming over last week are being heard, their asylum cases, prior to people who have been waiting in line, followed the rules, and did everything right?
Well, the
It's a
last
yes
in,
or
first
no,
out.
because I've run out of time.
Well, because people are coming in are going through the immigration courts, not through the affirmative asylum process at USCIS and generally, so it's two different populations. But I think we need to fund backlog reduction in affirmative asylum. I'm 100% in agreement with that. It's a problem.
Yeah, we need to stop the flow so we can actually get to these cases, but appreciate all of your testimony, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields. I now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes of a closing statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank our witnesses for being here today. Today, unfortunately, my Republican colleagues and some of the witnesses continue to fearmonger and perpetuate the hateful myth that migrants are criminals, dirty, and stealing American jobs. The reality is, and the data shows, that migrants are far less likely to commit crimes than American citizens. And the jobs that they are looking to take are ones that Americans are not taking. New Yorkers know better. We understand the contributions that immigrants have made to our economy, our city, the fabric of our country. As the home of Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty, many immigrants have come through New York and made it the melting pot of the world to the great benefit of so many, including Mr. Borelli. Republicans refuse to admit to a few important facts. Immigrants boost economic activity, promote innovation, and, importantly, when given lawful work authorization, pay hundreds of billions of dollars in taxes. So when we complain, and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle complain about taxpayer money that is propping up and paying for the migrant situation that we're dealing with, there's a solution, which is that if they are included in our communities and in our workforce, they will pay taxes. Businesses need the labor. Mr. Borelli acknowledged that. I certainly hear that from the business community in New York, which wants labor. There's a labor shortage in many different industries. And border security is a very serious issue that Democrats take very seriously. But unfortunately, as Ranking Member Thompson said, my Republican colleagues' treatment of the problem is not serious. Instead, what we get is a litany of blame Biden excuses. Let me just rattle off a couple that we heard here today. We should blame Biden for the deteriorating governments in Central and Latin America that is forcing so many to flee from corruption, destitution, and political persecution fear from criminal enterprises. We should blame Biden because he is, quote, complicit in the criminal enterprise of the cartels. And Biden has enabled cartels to prey on the border through human trafficking and the fentanyl trade. Blame Biden for that. And blame Biden, Mr. Borelli said, for the cost of this situation falling so much on New York City. Both of the witnesses from state government said today that Arizona in Mr. Lyons' case and New York in Mr. Borelli's case should not pay for the expenses that are coming from the inflow of migrants. I agree with that. I agree. But the problem is Congress appropriates money. President Biden and the administration do not. They cannot print money. And so the mechanism that is available to pay for localities and states to house and support migrants is called the Shelter and Services Program. In H.R. 2, Republicans have zeroed that out. But the White House supplemental appropriations bill includes additional funding for states and localities to pay for this. And if we want to talk about costs, we are heading head first into a government shutdown, which is going to cost U.S. taxpayers $6 billion a week. My Republican colleagues do not seem to care about a government shutdown that will cost $6 billion a week. Instead, they want to cut all sorts of non-discretionary spending, including in the Department of Homeland Security. And their proposal would cut the budget by 8%. That would be over $2 billion. Customs and Border Protection, which Mr. Lyons, you've encouraged to be boosted, would have to reduce its workforce by 800 officers and agents. Tens of thousands of pounds of drugs would come in because of that reduction. So it is Republicans here who are failing, who are creating this crisis for their own cynical political game. We need work authorization. There's a statutory requirement for asylees to wait 180 days in order to apply for work authorization. The administration cannot change that. Congress can. We need more immigration judges to deal with the backlog of asylum claims. The administration cannot unilaterally do that. Congress must do that, and that is in the White House's supplemental bill. We need to address the cartel's control of the border. And how are they controlling the border? They are controlling the border through guns, and those guns are coming from the United States. We need, as Congress, to address that. And there are many other ways that we can reduce the problem at the border, including more border security, which is also in the White House supplemental appropriations requests. There are unquestionably near-term costs to sheltering migrants, but the solution is not to shut them out, to stick them on the street in horrific conditions, to give them to the cartels to do with them what they will. We can help cities like New York without rejecting the fundamental values of the United States of America. Mr. Borelli understandably did not like some of the xenophobic comments from the 19th century about Italian immigrants coming over here. Thankfully, those really no longer exist, but there are other forms of xenophobia that are just as wrong. We can treat people with humanity, especially those who are escaping horrific conditions, as we work, hopefully together, to fix our broken immigration system, because both Democrats and Republicans agree that it's broken. So let's not play political games for electoral benefit. Let's get together and find some actual solutions. It cannot be on the administration itself. It does not have the power to fix our system. It has to be on Congress. And we, on the Democratic side of the aisle, welcome further discussions with our Republican colleagues to address the root cause of these problems and fix our system. It's time for us to get back to work that this committee was created after 9/11 to do. Mr. Chairman, I hope we can build on this and continue to work together to actually find solutions to the problem, not just not just blame others for the problems. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we would ask the witnesses to respond to those in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be open for about 10 days, or for 10 days. I want to thank the ranking member for just now admitting that the cartels have control of the border. Again, it looks like we keep moving the needle here, and it's encouraging. I do want to thank the witnesses for being here and for coming in. I know Arizona, that's at least a two-leg flight, right? And we had a train we had to negotiate around, so thank you two for coming. And are you from DC? Okay, so we're still very glad that you're here today. Thanks for coming, and we appreciate your heartfelt testimony from all of you guys. Look, nobody has said that every migrant who comes across our southern border is a criminal. And that's just a false statement, okay? Nobody has said that they're dirty or anything like that. I think making the point about defecating in spinach fields, maybe that's the interpretation or how we got to that comment, but that's just a reality of what you're dealing with in southern Arizona. So I appreciate you pointing it out and how it creates a financial cost to the farmers, but nobody's saying that. And this continued suggestion that pushing back and trying to get border security is somehow racist or xenophobic it's just not fair. You know, that's political gamesmanship, really at its best. Because you know, I don't want. I mean, we can look at the 160 plus countries that are violating our southern border. It isn't about race. It just isn't. It's about security. And so, you know, when we hear that from the other side, it's almost, well, what are you hiding? I mean, what are you deflecting for? I mean, if you want to defend the policies at the southern border, defend the policy, defend what Mayorkas is doing, but don't just say things that aren't true. And I want to reiterate that this committee is not the Judiciary Committee. We're the Homeland Security Committee. I think we all recognize that there are immigration laws that need to be changed. That's important. But this committee's responsibility is border security. And if anything has been demonstrated by the policies of this administration, if you change the admission policies or you create an incentive for people to come, they're going to come in mass waves. You're going to create a migration crisis if you tear down all the barriers that are there, both physical and detention and all the other things that are in the law. Today we looked at the financial costs of an open border. And to use Mr. Magaziner's words, the humanitarian crisis at our southern border. Again, I feel like we're getting somewhere. We heard from our witnesses billions and billions of dollars. The crisis has cost the taxpayers of just one city $6 billion just next year. One city, the city of New York. But let's compare for just a second, and no offense to the great people of New York City. I remember when I was a cadet at West Point, enjoying that city very much on the weekends when I finally got my freedom from that place. But, you know, you're a city of 12 million people, right? About 12 million, 11 million? 8.1 million? Okay, so it's down from what it was, 8.1 million. And you got about 330 something coming a day, 350 coming a day. El Paso's a city of 200,000. They've had 800 and something a day. So I get that it's $6 billion, and I really appreciate Mayor Adams just speaking out, but, and this is, the border cities are just getting hammered. It's untenable, to use a friend's words. You know, the minority party has said that there's some kind of financial upside to the way that Secretary Mayorkas' policies are working right now with migration. Well, if that's the case, then why is Mayor Adams saying that it's going to destroy his city? If what we're doing today has some financial benefit, the way we're doing it today, because that's what we're looking into, we're oversighting what's going on right now. So if there is some financial upside, why is this mayor, who is a Democrat, saying this is going to destroy his city? I'm sure Mayor Adams recognizes that he'd love to have people working, filling those empty jobs. Well, why? Demand that the federal government do something and suggest that it's somehow hurting his city. Let's look at how we got here, because my colleagues across the aisle want to keep reflecting back to the previous administration. We heard several of our colleagues just, revert back to that. Why Secretary Mayorkas, when he came in, changed 89 policies is unfathomable to me. We had a peak in the previous administration, we did, and policies were implemented, and the numbers, the deterrence occurred, and the numbers went way down, way down. But when those policies were removed, people tested the system. They came in and they were released into our country, and so they called home. They called home, and they said, hey, you can come in now. And millions came. And a migration crisis was created by the removal of those policies. And the unfortunate thing, one thing if that was it, I'd still be opposed to that, but it'd be one thing if that was it. But the other side of the coin is the cartels took advantage of that. The cartels saw an opportunity. And so they started charging all these people coming. They don't allow them to flow through Mexico unless they pay them, right? Putting billions of dollars into the pockets of horrible criminals. Show video after video of them burning human bodies, decapitating people. We're giving them billions of dollars with these policies that are gone and this incentive that we've created. And oh, by the way, when they overwhelm the border crossers or the Border Patrol, they then bypass with fentanyl, bypass with nefarious folks who don't want to just get caught and released into the country. And they are, meanwhile, pocketing billions. And Americans are dying. The mass waves of people caused by the changed policies is the cause of the billions of dollars that our taxpayers are having to shell out, period. That's what's happening. That's how we got here. We're not talking about legal migration, we're talking about illegal migration. My colleagues know this is not politically defensible. They're not saying, sure, it's okay that Mayorkas is breaking the Immigration and Naturalization Act. They won't ever say that because they want the laws they pass to be lived out. So they're not going to say that, so they're going to deflect to the previous administration. They're going to deflect that, no, we need new immigration laws. They're going to deflect to how many hearings we've had on this issue. Call it a dog and pony show. I think the ranking member called it. I'm sorry. The financial costs to the taxpayers of flawed border policies are exactly what we should be looking into. Billions and billions. They suggest that it's some kind of, that on our side we haven't taken action. Well, that's not honest. Now you could say we disagree with H.R. 2. That would be the honest thing to say. But if you say, oh, they've done nothing, which was said, that's dishonest. How about we just say we've got two different solutions here to the problem. we agree to disagree, and we'll fight you at the ballot box and we'll implement our policy when we win. But you can't honestly say we have done nothing. You also can't say all we've done is border stuff. We ran some numbers. It's about 53 or 54% of our committee hearings have been on border. It's a pretty big deal right now, I would think, with 107,000 dead in one year and 116,000 dead in another year, to the fentanyl pouring across that porous open border. I think it should be looked into, but you can't say that's all we're doing. We've had great hearings on the Arctic. We've had great hearings on emergency management issues. Our subcommittees are doing a fantastic job. And both the chairman of those subcommittees and the ranking members, we've had bipartisan legislation come out of those. Myself and Mr. Swalwell had a bill together. I mean, you can't make the argument, honestly, that this is all we're doing. And that's just more deflection. Why? Because the current policies can't be defended. Our national security is tied to border security. Examining the crisis at the border is exactly what we should be doing, and I won't be lectured by people who say these things are wasting the committee's time. It's costing this nation billions of dollars. Again, I reiterate, why would Mr. Adams say that if there was some upside to the way it's happening right now? Do I agree immigration reform is necessary? Yes. But that's not this committee's job. This committee's job is to secure this nation, Homeland security. And the current situation at the border is untenable. As Ms. Green pointed out, the statistics of just the last 4 days, 9,300 in the last 24 hours, 9,700. We see the trains full of people coming. We had 2,200 cross in the Del Rio sector in one day. They were completely overwhelmed. Why are so many people coming? I think someone mentioned Venezuela, or the countries of Latin America, and how we've bashed on Mr. Biden because of the situations down there. No one here today said Mr. Biden is at fault because of the situations going on in Latin America. Although I will point out, I think it's the socialist, far-left government in Venezuela that destroyed that country. I will make that observation. But no one here on our side of the aisle said Mr. Biden has caused that. What we have said is that the policies that were done away with, that were working, have resulted in people saying, come on, and they've come. And so that's why we got to shine a light on it, educate the American people what's going on. That's why we got to dig into this. We'll continue to do so. We're in phase 4 of a 5-phase investigation. And we looked in the dereliction of duty of just the laws that have not been followed. I'm sorry, if you take an oath to the Constitution, you're in the executive branch, you should execute the laws. If you're in the legislative branch, you should pass laws and do oversight. And I agree, fund. But we've got to stop playing the political game. Let's look at these failed policies. Let's call them what they are. Phase 2, how this cartel situation is starting to spread all across our country. And we showed in San Francisco where the cartels have connected with the gangs and are working to create a nexus of crime all over America. It's not wrong to look at that. It's Homeland Security. Phase 3, we looked at the human costs of these policies because you know what? We just had a kid in New York, a little baby, die in the Bronx. That's unacceptable. Unacceptable for men and women who've risen their hand and said, I will defend our nation. And today we're looking at the financial costs. And I'm sorry, again, I make the point, and I know this is redundant. Mayor Adams, a Democrat, would not be, if there was some net positive, he'd not be screaming, help, this is destroying my city. And next phase, we'll look into some things that informants have come and whispered in our ear. And we'll talk about that in the appropriate time. But we're committed to getting to the bottom of this. to exposing it, and hopefully winning more hearts and continuing to move the needle. There is a crisis at our southern border, and it is harming our country, and it is killing Americans, and it is empowering drug cartels, and it needs to stop. With that, without objection, the committee is adjourned.